Hi, I'm Seth Pinsky. I'm the CEO of the 92nd Street Y, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the 4th annual City of Tomorrow Summit. You're joining me here today on the rooftop of the 92nd Street Y, where we're busy building, as you may be able to tell, the future of the 92nd Street Y. The 92nd Street Y is a place where important conversations about important topics have always taken place. And as a New York institution, perhaps no topic is more important to us at this point in time than the future of cities generally, and our city, New York, in particular. That's why I'm so excited to welcome all of you to day one of the summit. And I'd like to give a big thank you to 100 Stories, the co-producer of our event, and to our sponsors, Delos, EQ Office, Mount Sinai, Savannah College of Art and Design, Y Lighting, Durst, Jamestown, and to our media sponsor, El Decor. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy this summit.
I'm Jonathan Bowles. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future. Thanks so much for joining us. We are here for the panel, Building a More Equitable City. I'm really excited about this panel. I think it's really clear to so many New Yorkers right now that New York not only needs to bounce back from this health and economic crisis, it needs to do so in a way that's more inclusive and more equitable. Today, we'll be tackling one of the key aspects of this, how to address years of systemic racism in our infrastructure. We've got some fantastic panelists to help us delve into these issues, and I'm going to introduce them right now very quickly. Eran Chen is the founding principal of ODA and one of the most prolific architects in New York, with recent projects including the conversion of the Arbuckle Sugar Refinery in Dumbo and the forthcoming 420 Kent Avenue Towers on Williamsburg's waterfront. Charles Davis II is an assistant professor of architectural history and criticism at the University at Buffalo SUNY. His academic research excavates the role of racial identity and race thinking in architectural history and contemporary design culture. And Shachi Pandey is an urban designer and founder of Metropolitan Urban Design Workshop, which is dedicated to the regeneration of neighborhoods and public places. So let's jump right into it. This is a question really for anyone, for all of you. What do you see as the opportunities to build a more equitable city and address systemic racism in our city's infrastructure?
I can start.
Eran, go ahead.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here and with these fantastic and established colleagues. I think that in this time of health crisis, the social unrest and real estate market instability, there's actually an unprecedented opportunity to develop sort of a new type of urban hierarchy that I believe will lead to more human and equitable cities. Before I explain why now is the best time, maybe I just want to touch on the three areas that I think needs greatest improvement. The first one is social housing or affordable housing, not the kind of affordable housing that we've been used to seeing in remote sort of underserved community. These, I believe, to some degree cements the problem of social inequality and systematic racisms, because they're usually built in the worst areas or designed by kind of mediocre architecture and with the least investments in quality of living. And I refer to affordable housing that is integrated within the free market housing. I would like to see affordable apartments in every area of the city, dispersed in every building. So having fewer financial means doesn't mean that you're being kicked farther and farther from the city centers. So there are plans, the 30 and 70, 80, 20 plans, they exist, but I think they're too limited. And I think that could be done by city regulations with the right incentives for developers. We've been involved in designing a few of those in really big scales, and they're extremely successful. So imagine that every residential building in the city had a small percentage of affordability. I think we would live in a better society. Number two is I think we have to increase the public realm. We can continue to rely on sidewalk shopping and parks that were designed decades ago for a city. only for outdoor spaces. I think with the growth of density, we should grow the public realm. How do we do it? I believe one of the ways is through PPP, which is the PPP incentive program. It's privately owned public spaces, where we can take areas from the private lots and give them back to the public. In fact, every building, I believe, that is designed today should be giving something back to the community. An example, we've been working on a big project in Queens, master plan, where 25% of the private land that is meant for construction is dedicated as public spaces. It's quarter of the footprint. And it's dedicated for parks, civic plaza, open markets, artist gardens, kids playground, you name it. And but it's important also that the outdoor spaces, both the new ones that we're creating, but also the old ones that exist right now, are actually programmed in a way that would be engaging for all types of society. For example, local mom and pop shops, makerspace, adults education facilities, food markets, etc., art and culture. How do we do this? Well, I know that we say retail is dying. In fact, I think traditional retail is dead. And we all start to realize that active, open to all streets makes better and more desirable buildings above. And again, the right city regulations and new zoning ordinance would help to achieve that. And last but not least, mixed-use neighborhoods. I believe that we need to stop our dependence on mass transit and create more walkable communities where, we can work, live, and play in a walking distance. We need to decentralize our city, I believe. We're housing creative offices, light manufacturing, urban farming, as well as education, healthcare stuff are all in the same area. So one doesn't have to be reached to see a Broadway show. You can go to a local theater or spend 2 hours and commute necessarily to work every day, but work locally. If we have multiple centers, if we stop relying on Manhattan for work and culture, if people get easy access to city life, I believe we'll have a more equitable city. And just why now? Because I think COVID have showed us that how desperate we all are, for locality, for fresh air, for access to nature, and how bad cities are for the weak and poor, and how vulnerable we all are when we ignore kind of quality and inequality. So while office space is crushing, retail is kind of disappearing, prices of construction is coming down, now is the time, I feel, for city agencies to be proactive and innovative and change our lives in the city for the better. I hope it wasn't too long.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Charles, what about you?
So thank you, Jonathan, for this invitation and hosting this conversation, which I hope will be very productive. For me, what's interesting is sort of observing the disproportionate burdens that were placed upon low-income workers and people of color, particularly as a result of COVID. And also thinking about the ways that New York City's demography and class structure might be shifting as some people are deciding to move out, and you might see changes in who remains in the city and who gains access to the city. For me, what I think is important to focus on, and one will sort of reiterate some of the issues I've already discussed, which is housing reform and allowing for changes in housing and access to housing. But I think for me, I'm really interested in avenues of community control over certain spaces, particularly for those who were the most burdened during the COVID crisis. And then I'm also interested in what I would imagine is a big issue in New York City and continues to be, which is reforms in policing, allowing for a more equitable kind of policing across the city, which would come from either more integrated neighborhoods or at least a greater and more vigorous amount of community control over these different types of forms of policing. And so I think we can do this in several ways. So in contrast to what was recommended earlier, there's also this growing movement for community land trusts within the city. There's already been legislation passed by the city council, both recognizing this as a kind of official form of public-private partnership, and seeding monies for the support of this type of work. There have been recent court cases that have awarded the leadership of community land trusts to start to do these projects. And so I think what we need to see now is a really successful set of demonstration projects. So coming back into the city as things settle down, having the city work with these nonprofits to establish 3, 4, or 5 really good models that then can be emulated throughout the city. I think we can do this either through the Department of City Planning, actually taking the numbers that they have of the new demographies coming back into the city and helping them to reassess this, or it can be done through partnership with planning departments at local colleges and nonprofits. And I also think that in terms of the reform of policing within the city, we need at least 2 things. We need a stronger and more centralized civilian complaint review board that includes things like the election of members as opposed to just the appointment of members. And then we need to investigate the kinds of mechanisms that can be used to take the kinds of directives and initiatives that such a review board would establish, really understanding what the community thinks should be the common standard for policing, and allowing for that to then become policy within the police force. There are probably many ways of doing so. I believe in the kind of sharing of responsibilities between the police union and the police force and this particular review board, but there might be many other types of models in place. But for me, I think those 2 things would allow for working class people and people of color to live in New York in a way that is much more equitable than was the case previously.
Before I move into Shachi, Charles, let me just follow up just to make sure everyone in the audience understands. Can you just help us unpack a little bit the community control that you talked about? Like, what does that mean? And also, I think not everybody probably understands what a community land trust is. I thought it was great to for you to explain how you think we get there, but help us understand a little bit more what that is and why you think it'll be so helpful in building a more equitable city.
So my understanding of what a community land trust is sort of based on an idea that was established by Black farmers in our historical past, where parts of the community own the land upon which development is based. And then they have a say over what types of programs and what types of initiatives happen on that land. And it's a way of stemming unregulated speculation within a space that will allow for forms of control and forms of say within the community itself. And so that could go anywhere from owning the land that a particular building is put upon to owning a block or set of blocks that were ceded from ownership by the city directly to the community. And these usually happen in terms of 99-year leases, and then it returns sort of back to the city to allow for stability. And so those who would typically be displaced by increased development caused by gentrification could have an anchor into a particular location. And community land trust is just one sense of that. And so this is all a kind of philosophy, two-pronged philosophy that you want your community to be diverse, and you want it to have a kind of diversity of class and racial demographies. But also the sense that, at least in the 2 areas that I focus on, housing and policing, that you tend to want a civilian-controlled public realm, and then to have the elements and amenities within that public realm doing what it is that the community wants to accomplish. And so finding a way to understand what the consensus is within the community, I think is an important mechanism. So I'm just sort of discussing certain mechanisms and forums by which that can take place.
Excellent, thank you. Shachi, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Jonathan, again for inviting me for this panel, and I'm delighted to be among such esteemed colleagues. I completely agree with what Eran and Charles just said, and to reiterate, I think that one of the things that we have at our disposal today that we probably did not have in the past centuries is technology and the ability to really help that bring equity in our cities and in our social and public realms. And I think that that has given us the opportunity to look at things from the point of view of abundance rather than scarcity, and supply to or produce enough basic infrastructure for everyone's needs. But that hasn't, fundamentally happened because we still design our marketplace and economy based on this idea of scarcity. And I think that that's, we need to, fundamentally change that, not only in the public realm, but also in private businesses in order to achieve greater equity. Some specific ways that both Eran and Charles alluded to were things like, housing and building land commons or land trusts or banking land. But I think that fundamentally, if we looked at the model of cooperative ownership in social infrastructure and recognized that some needs are basics, like some social infrastructure are basic needs for everybody in the society, including things like health, access to education, as well as housing, then I think we would be able to build a much stronger workforce and a much more equitable society. Another thing that I think is, excuse me, another thing that I think, I guess that what we're all trying to say is this idea of, in cooperative ownership, this idea of kind of economic democracy, where owners have a say participate not only in figuring out what is the outcome, but they are consistently being educated throughout the process and being able to make decisions in controlling the outcome and not just giving their input in terms of what it is that they hope the outcome to be. So what we do that way is, make the end users and active participants in creating that economy and in creating the outcomes in our public places, in public infrastructure. And I think that therefore the exploring models of cooperative ownership, not only for housing, but also in infrastructure, is something that our city governments are going to have to do. And then one more thing that I think with through technology and planning and data analysis that we can start to do is we need to figure out a way to redistribute resources and understand where it is that how to tax what resources so that there is more equitable distribution and access to these resources amongst all communities. I think I'm going to stop there and get into some of the more specifics as we go on this conversation.
Well, let me actually seize on that, Shachi. That's a great point about kind of inequitable distribution of resources. I mean, one of the things I think about is we've seen the creation of some really amazing parks in the last decade or two. I think that have added immensely to the city's quality of life. But most of them are right on the waterfront, either in Manhattan or overlooking across the water from Manhattan, many of them in affluent neighborhoods. And, how do we make sure that the kind of investment that's happened there, in part funded by, some of the development that's occurred, how do we make sure that extends in other parts of the city? We also have, when we talk about infrastructure, we have public housing. And Eran, you talked about social housing. The public housing we have, NYCHA, is in such states of disrepair. The kind of unmet infrastructure capital need is, I think over $30 billion right now. And I think that we as a city struggle to figure out how to deal with that. So kind of hitting on your point, Shachi, like how do we deal with that inequitable investment? Where do we get dollars to make sure that there are projects built in every corner of the city?
Maybe I'll tap on this if I may, Jonathan. I think it's a great question because at the end of the day, it comes down to dollars and to investment. And I think that there's got to be an increased investments from the city in more equitable opportunities, and you touched on that parks that are being built in Brooklyn on the waterfront, et cetera. Beyond the city support, they are also relied on a lot of private money and donations within their community. And how do you gauge that in areas that are less, less fortunate? And there's two ways to look at this. One way is to look at the government or the city as the driver of these programs. And unfortunately, what you mentioned about NYCHA, I've seen again and again how these programs are not sustainable, and some of them are falling apart. And therefore, I'm very bullish on trying to rely on private sectors in order to create more equitable city. Not as the only avenue, but as a strong avenue. Meaning that how do we create an incentives for private money to create those spaces? And I do think that if you look at the logic of, for example, a simple zoning regulation called the plaza regulation in every city, where cities, developers can build a tower that is slightly higher or have a little bit more FAR if they create a plaza at the front of their building. That's a plaza regulation, sort of an incentive system. We have to come up with smarter and more innovative incentive systems that would drive those public realms in places that are less desirable. And I am a strong believer that we can do it while tapping on private investment and not only relying on government money, because unfortunately, City of New York is now, 10 billion, I don't know what the number is currently, $10 billion of deficit, and we need to create those opportunities. I do think it's possible, and we've done this in Queens, in Astoria. We're looking at the places in the Bronx, remote places as well, where you're saying, look, developer, you've got this piece of land. I demand that you create a meaningful public realm, public facility. I demand that you facilitate a type of ground floor retail, for example, based on dollar amount that would allow for local businesses to thrive. And I demand that you create more diverse type of program at the ground floor, including elements like after-school education and other facilities, community facilities and others, as part of your zoning regulation. But in return, I'm giving you, let's say, floor area or height. That balancing act has not been mastered, unfortunately, I feel yet, but it has a lot of opportunities. And I think if we're smart about it and we play that right, we can find great public spaces being created in more remote places.
I'd like to add to that sure, FAR bonuses are, a great way to leverage private dollars where necessary in the creation, in capital infrastructure development. I also think that it is our responsibility to make sure that these places are accessible. And by that, I mean that the mix of businesses and the mix of housing in these areas, that needs to be very consciously thought about so that we're not consistently, creating places of hypercapitalism.
Absolutely.
And that I think is extremely critical, because more often than not, a lot of the times as these places get developed, in some of the most prime areas that are really expensive, these places tend to, become inaccessible, and by that I don't mean physically inaccessible, but inaccessible to or more exclusive. And I think that to ensure that, we have to consistently and very consciously keep pushing, and I would say even increase than the 20% affordable housing norm that we have, to make sure that we're not only are we not providing affordable housing, but that we, and that's different from displacement, that we are consciously figuring out that how do we not displace the existing businesses and the existing residences from that area, to ensure that there is accessibility to these resources.
And I'd like to sort of contribute to this conversation from one of the angles that was discussed earlier, which is like this idea of community or communal ownership. Because I think that previously, a lot of the ways that people like renters and those who did not own property were dismissed was because they were not owners. And so in that sense, I think that allowing for community ownership within a kind of public-private endeavor gives them a voice as an equal partner. But then I would say, in addition to that, if we're going to rely on the private realm to be doing things and to be cooperating with public and private types of developments, then we need a strong public sector. And we need to be finding ways to increase the strength of our government so that it's not just about current deficits or surpluses, but it's about the ways and the roles that we look to government in order to intercede in these roles. And so in my perspective, you want New York City government to both have greater strength and greater stability in the ways that it manages its assets. And the long history of public housing is one of sort of temporary overinvestment and consistent underinvestment. At the very beginning, New York City was a leader in the world, particularly because they insisted on public-private development. And they resisted the federal government as a kind of sole state-run or sole federal-run kind of program. And that was its strength. But it's really the ebb and flow of the different values of administrations that causes some of these issues. But finding ways to create autonomy for these essential needs, these kind of municipal services, I think, would be crucial for a kind of future in New York.
Let me throw out one last question, if I may, Shashi, just because we have a few minutes left. And I feel like when I think about infrastructure, not only the needs, but the opportunities going forward, I feel like the city is going to have to make major investments in resiliency, preparing for climate change over the next several years, sustainability. And how do we do that? This is really to all of you in the remaining few minutes we have. Just how do we do that in a way that doesn't just perpetuate or intensify some of the kind of systemic environmental justice issues we've seen in the past, but that actually is done in a way that creates a more equitable city and gives all sorts of New Yorkers a chance to actually benefit from this. And so we know what's ahead. What do we need to be doing now to plan for it so that it happens in an equitable way? Shachi, do you want to start?
Sure. I think, this idea of cooperative ownership that we've been talking about is actually something that we can, is something that's central to this idea of achieving the long-term goal of climate resiliency. And I think that we can start to think about that right now. For example, there is this local law now, 97, where buildings are going to have to be retrofitted for to reduce their energy and carbon emissions. And by 2024, they're going to have to benchmark, and meet the standards that the city has laid out. So I would say that programs that create good jobs and workforce development, invest in workforce development and create good jobs, to then provide the demand that this law is going to, then generate. And all of these buildings in New York and Manhattan, Brooklyn, they'll need to be retrofitted. I think that's one immediate way that we can start right away. Workforce development and creating cooperative businesses that are owned by not just in another private entity, but by all of the workers, and that are, supplying retrofits to all of these to all the buildings. That's one. And I think that the recent pandemic has kind of, shown that the issue of environmental justice and social equity are really intertwined. So I think we're going to have to keep looking at social equity and keep working towards things like investment in public transportation, investment in things like universal pre-K, and provide access to basic health, basic transportation, housing, and education infrastructure so that we can consciously become part of making the decision for our environment together.
We got 30 seconds left. Ron, Charles, anyone want to jump in?
Well, the only thing I would add is that being a parent at home and still having to work, you realize also how important internet access is. So I would add that to the things that need to be equitable. We need to find some way to make sure that these signals are boosted across the city, not just in certain parts.
I'll just say with the 3 seconds, I think it all comes down to leadership on city planning and city level, orchestrating the symphony called the city. All of these programs needs to push for quality and equality. And I totally agree that there have been examples in the past few years, without naming names, of projects that were built for one sector of the community only. I don't understand it. Nobody understands it. How affordable housing didn't get into account there. How accountability of ground floor programs has not been discussed. These are failures that has to be corrected, while they fail because of, I think, leadership. And at the end of the day, all of these things that were discussed today, it's a sea of different opportunities, has to be orchestrated by a strong leadership from city planning, which I'm looking forward for it to come, especially now when I think there's opportunity after COVID to restructure some of these topics that were discussed.
All right, well, it's nice to end on an optimistic note. I agree there is an opportunity here. And anyway, thank you so much for our panelists. That was a great discussion, and have a good day.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
SCAD Pro is a unique opportunity for industry to engage with academia. It gives them a chance to work with our students and our faculty. When industry partners come to SCAD Pro, every challenge they have is unique. SCAD students and faculty take a rigorous design approach to problem solving. SCAD Pro partners value the different skill sets that students bring together in order to provide unique solutions that are well-researched, that are innovative, and that are on target.
We've got experts from interior design, user experience, game design, architecture, structures.
We've been training our students to always deliver in any kind of situation professionally. We're using technology to bridge remote collaboration.
It's always been about going one step further, looking into that place that nobody else would check out.
I think the best way that this project has helped me prepare for the future is by exposing us to reality, because by the end of the day, it has to be a win-win solution. Your clients should be as happy as you are with your proposal.
I feel that the relationship that I've been able to build with the SCAD Pro team, for me, it builds the foundations and connections that we needed in creative field.
I wish I would have known about this 20 years ago. It's like nothing I've ever seen before.
I was blown away by the presentations. The students were phenomenal. We're really excited to now take those ideas and bring them to life.
I've been fortunate to work with students here through industry partnerships while I led design at Adobe and Microsoft, and now at Uber. I've also hired a number of SCAD graduates. I've had the great good pleasure of watching my son transformed by an education here at SCAD.
It was a really cool experience for me because it really put me in the space of, okay, this is what I definitely want to do, and I'm capable of doing it. I'm really excited about where this leads in my career.
The students of SCAD work hard to make solutions that really solve other people's problems. If the question is, are they prepared, then I want to hire them all right now. Yeah, they're prepared.
Hello, I'm Eleanor McCune, an interior design major and preservation design minor at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Global leaders, like all of you here today, can look to SCAD to find the next big idea. Through SCAD Pro, the university's innovation studio and think tank, industry meets creativity when top companies partner with SCAD talent like me. At SCAD, I've had the opportunity to work on collaborative projects, including an award-winning concept that envisions the future of the workplace. With my classmates, we reimagined how people connect and create, no matter where they're located. One of the first things that attracted me to SCAD was the city of Savannah itself. Welcome to the panel, Cities Beyond New York, What's Working? Let's get started with moderator Nicole Flatow, managing editor for City Lab in Washington, D.C.
So this panel today is quite apt. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with my really esteemed guests today. We're going to be talking about Cities Beyond New York, What's Working, which is a pretty broad scope of coverage, and we have here some folks who are experts on a number of the biggest questions facing cities. I think we can all agree that one thing is certain: there's a great deal of attention on cities at this moment, particularly how they'll adapt or survive post-COVID. Are they places of protest, places where some of the greatest solutions to problems like climate change will emerge? I'm hoping we can scratch the surface of some of those questions today with our truly esteemed panel. So if I may, I'm just going to jump right into it with Vishaan. You've made the case that we would be happier and lead more sustainable lives if only our living environments were more urban. Can you unpack what the attributes are of this ideal urban environment? What are examples of places that have come closer to achieving it? And how, if at all, in your view, is that vision challenged by the narratives of COVID?
Sure. Thank you for having me. You know, I think cities are one of our great hopes. Not only because when people live in denser environments, they tend to use mass transportation, live in smaller housing units, don't have all the carbon impacts of sprawl, but even beyond all those things is just the basic need for human connection. And in fact, you know, what we've seen with COVID is that we all miss each other. We're desperate for human connection and to get reconnected. And I think there are many cities around the world. I mean, we must start with Helsinki and the extraordinary things the mayor has done in terms of meeting the SDGs, but you know, Paris, Barcelona, all over South America, there are examples in Central America, and even in the United States, we've seen in Oakland, they're shutting down streets from cars and making them more pedestrian friendly. There's great community land trust ideas building up around the country. And so, you know, I think cities are a hotbed of democracy, and it's where it's bubbling those ideas up from the surface and making them more places for people that we can really focus on. And I think it can get us through some of the deep, deep challenges that we've got.
And do you think about that any differently post-COVID than you did before?
No, not really. I mean, in the sense that, again, COVID to me has just proven how much we need each other. See, technologists and economists have been telling us for years, since the invention of the telephone, they've been telling us that we don't need cities, that we will, as soon as technology allows us, we can all work alone on top of mountaintops and not see each other. And it's predicated on the idea that human beings actually don't like each other very much. And I think quite the opposite is true. This is the technological dream, and it's a nightmare. No one really wants to live this way. People miss each other. And I think this is actually proof of how important cities are.
That's great. Well, we'll dig into some of the specifics. To your point about Helsinki, let's turn to our mayor here. You've declared the goal for your city to become the most functional city in the world, which is a really interesting lens to approach a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today. Tell me what that means in brief, and in particular, how has that affected your approach to tackling COVID-19, particularly as cases are starting to rise again, both in Helsinki and surrounding areas?
Let me start by just saying that I agree to up to 100% of what Vishaan just told us. And I'd like just to add that the alternative to a more urban life would be a disaster from a sustainability point of view. And that argument alone should convince us that the future will be urban despite of COVID. But then concerning our mission to become the most functional city in the world, I believe that we are living in a world with a huge amount of different kind of transformations. We are living in a world which changes more rapidly and more profoundly than ever before. We are also living in a world where the role and importance of cities is growing all the time. And putting these two together, I believe, and I did when I wrote the strategy for the city 3 years ago, that a city which is reliable, predictable, functional, which simply works, is actually even becoming luxury. And let me say that actually COVID has proven that this is more or less true. The fact that we have been able to go through the first wave of the COVID with relatively small losses, the secret of our success is not that we have found different kind of restrictions than other cities did all around the world, but the secret lies in the fact that our people trust the government, it trusts the city, and they follow whatever restrictions we are giving. And now when we are facing the second wave, you could say that nothing has changed. We are still basing all our actions in the COVID era on the biggest strengths we have: a reliable, predictable, functional city based on trust.
And how does that manifest in terms of what policies you've chosen to enact during COVID specifically?
Actually, it hasn't. It hasn't that much. I mean, we are following more or less the same actions other cities, at least in Europe, has taken. I don't know the American reality that well. So if you compare Helsinki with Paris or London or Barcelona, I mean, we have more or less the same restrictions. Maybe the only difference is that due to the fact that the situation never became that bad here, we were not forced to go to a total lockdown.
Okay, and what is the current, your city is currently, what restrictions are in place now there? Are there any?
We have, most people are remote working. We can not have events with more than 50 people without special arrangements. We use masks more or less everywhere. And then we have a lot of restrictions concerning traveling to other countries. But otherwise, I mean, we don't actually have that many restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is there any contemplation if cases continue to go up again of adjusting that, or is that pretty much the course that you expect to continue on?
We have seen in all around the world, and especially in Europe, which is relevant for us, that the situation is becoming worse and worse all the time. So yes, we are expecting to have some additional restrictions in the near future. Let's see how it works, but it's maybe a little bit too early to estimate. But so far, we have followed the path of other countries, and if that's the case, even this time, we need to go to stricter restrictions soon. But still, I dare to say that no to total lockdowns and really hard measures taken by, for example, several American cities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, that's a good place to turn to Anthony, particularly during the height of lockdowns and in places that had lockdowns. Working here, Lyft now, I'm sure that you've seen some of the fruits of this. There's been a renaissance for bikes, at least in some places, and some drops in use of ride-hailing services such at Lyft. What have you seen and what adjustments are you making in your strategy to account for changing habits, if any?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here and agree with much of what's been said already. What I would say is for us, we've certainly seen during the peak of COVID so far, a drop in the utilization of rideshare, as you point out, but a very, very strong uptick in the utilization of our bike share program. We're the largest bike share provider in the country. And with the health of individuals at top of mind for people and unemployment skyrocketing, people are looking for different ways to get around a city, and safe, healthy, and affordable way to do that is using bikes. And we've even seen cities that are starting to close down streets and to create sort of bicycle highways for people to get in and out of the central business districts of American communities to both be healthy and safe as they travel from one place to another. And that's one of the reasons why we've been very proud to support something like the Resilient Streets Initiative, where we're working with cities to have much more robust conversation about what transportation solutions should look like post-COVID and to bring us into a brighter future.
Are you expecting those trends to continue as you plan for the future? And is that affecting your plans?
I think there will be a large number of people who've used a bike share program for the first time during this crisis and who will continue to use it after the crisis. I think in terms of the core rideshare business, I would expect that as health conditions improve, we'll see an uptick in utilization of that product. So I think we have very, very good prospects going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you mentioned that open streets programs where some streets have been limiting car use have enabled more use of bikes. Are there other changes that you would advocate cities should be enacting to allow for more of this bike use?
Yeah, we're looking at opportunities to work with transit agencies that are also facing sharp reductions in utilization right now and are looking for ways to ensure that people can get from one place to another. And I think connecting bike share support with transit support of communities is a critical next step. And I frankly think that rideshare is also another part of that combination. So we're seeing some of that in spots across the country, but I think it'll increase as time goes on.
Thank you. Let's turn back to Vishaan. So thus far, we've mostly been talking about some of the impacts of COVID, but even before COVID, there's been a bit of a shift over the last many years where cities were historically viewed as places of opportunity. But in recent years, many of the cities and parts of cities that meet many of our ideals of walkability, transit, public space, sustainability, several of those we've already hinted at today, are becoming accessible only to the wealthy, particularly because of housing unaffordability. In fact, you could say that one of the attributes that most characterizes the world's largest cities today is their inequality. And of course, inequality has been something that's come into very stark relief, both because of who has been affected by COVID itself and because, especially in the US, of protests around police brutality. Is it really possible to reach a vision for the ideal urban life that is also equitable using those same criteria that we've always valued? So walkability, transit, public space, sustainability as kind of the core values, or do we need to rethink what defines our greatest urban spaces?
Well, ideals are asymptotes, they're goals, right? And so I think it's important to have ideals. The issue is that we have an equity crisis in our cities, and we have been fed a narrative, which is that, especially in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well, that we either have the bankrupt cities of the 1970s or we have the bourgeois city of the 2000s. And so you either have a city that is filled with crime or filled with chain stores. And I think we've got to break out of that paradigm, and this is actually the opportunity to do it. We're going to have a massive housing crisis coming out of this pandemic. In the United States, we're going to see an extraordinary rise in homelessness and people who are rent burdened in terms of their ability to pay their rent. And I think this is a time for us to look to some of our partners in Europe and in Asia to understand what they are doing in terms of social housing. Because what we have done since really the mid-1980s is we've said the private sector is going to take care of it all. And just imagine that somehow that was going to work. I'm in Berkeley, where the founder of our college, Catherine Bauer, wrote the National Housing Act for FDR. And she envisioned a very strong, robust idea of investment in public housing and social housing. We have totally lost that ethos. And we are going to have to rethink, because as the mayor said, by 2100, we are going to have 10 billion people on this planet. Most of those people already live in cities. Most people will live in cities. We cannot have cities that have the kind of economic and social segregation we have, or we're going to have civil war. And rich people need to understand what's at stake for them if they don't start electing politicians and talking about investment in everyone. And I just think this is the moment to have a paradigm shift around the conversation about housing.
I think one way to probe what that looks like is actually to talk about a project which is in New York that you're working on called Sunnyside Yard, or that you've developed a plan for. It's a development in Queens on a former rail station that has some of the most affordable housing that would have been built in New York in a number of decades, has a lot of other markers of sustainability, et cetera, and I think has been lauded as this, pretty groundbreaking project. At the same time, there actually has been a fair bit of community resistance and also lawmaker resistance from representatives in those areas who say that any new massive development is not the right choice versus investing in existing neighborhoods. How do you think about that balance?
I think to the extent there's community resistance, it's because communities have become very distrustful of government in the United States. I mean, it's interesting to hear the mayor talk about how his citizens follow the rules that are given by the government. We have a breakdown in trust in government in the United States. And so it is very hard for communities to say, oh, this project is different. It's not going to gentrify my neighborhood. It's not going to displace my housing, right? But I really think that project harkens back to an era where we had the kind of public investment. That's 100% social housing. It's a net zero project. It sits on top of our best mass transportation. Of course we should be building things like that. It's 60 acres of park. The reason people don't trust it is because they haven't trusted what government has done over the course of the last 20 to 30 years in our country.
In your role as kind of the designer of that project, how do you think about what, if any, role designers can play in thinking, well, okay, this is a massive investment in a new project, but yet these residents are asking for investment in their current homes. What role at all, if at all, do I play in that kind of?
Sure, our job isn't just to design. Our job is to listen to communities and help advise our client about exactly those kinds of issues, what kind of investment can go. And you'll see our plan actually talks about a significant amount of investment in existing neighborhoods, and that can get lost in the shuffle. But I just think, a lot of us who are working in this field look to places like Helsinki and say, what are the things that we can emulate, here in the United States? But unfortunately, we don't have the same national economic system, and so we are always fighting a kind of tide at the local level.
Absolutely. So going back to your point about homelessness, Mayor, in Helsinki, your city has been a model for reducing homelessness using what's called a housing first model. So you've housed many people who were sleeping on the streets or in shelters. Now, during coronavirus, even more than before, more other cities are starting to take this idea more seriously, or I guess we'll see how that pans out. But at least during the period of this pandemic, more folks have been housed in hotels and some other slightly more robust accommodations. And there's a more overt public health argument in favor of it, that it will reduce the spread of the virus. Tell us, for these other cities, how you did it. In particular, where did you find the resources to provide this housing?
So that I love this question, because the housing first model was created by my administration during the time when I was the Minister of Housing in Finland. I mean, the starting point is that you have to understand that, of course, reducing homelessness, and especially long-term homelessness, is just right from a humanity point of view. But then you need to convince your people that it also has economic motivations and motivations which are related to the livability of the city, that it just becomes a more pleasant city with a lower rate of criminality if you have less homelessness people. The starting point was to understand that if a person has a long-term homelessness, the homelessness is actually not his or her biggest problem. It's a combination of unemployment, being poor, misusing drugs or alcohol, criminal record, and so on and so on. And especially in Finland, a main challenge was that most of all homeless people had problems with alcohol. And we used to think that you first need to get rid of booze in order to get a flat. And then we turned it the other way around, that actually you need first have to have a flat in order to be able to get rid of booze. And that was the main principle of the Housing First model. Then we made a deal between the state and the 10 biggest cities in the country and some big NGOs that we built, I think at that time it was 3,000 flats for long-term homelessness. And it was a deal where the cities and the NGOs stood for building the flats. The state gave us a very low rate loan, and then we split the cost for the extra healthcare services we needed for the flats. And now, I mean, roughly 10 years afterwards, I think that actually we saved more money than we put to build those flats due to a much lower pressure on our healthcare system, a lower rate of criminality, and a more pleasant, livable city center where investors are more interested in due to not seeing homeless people in the streets.
And how, if at all, has that shifted during coronavirus as the economy gets worse? Are you seeing a surge?
Absolutely not at all. Not at all. I mean, we are, of course, the biggest challenge for us, I think that is the challenge for most cities, is that due to COVID, you get a huge amount of more unemployed people than you had before. And of course, if they are poor enough, then it may even happen that they lose their homes. But in our system, that is not probable. And at least so far, we don't see more homeless people than we had before the COVID. And I mean, when we are talking about our recovery plan for the city, the first point is how to take care of the most vulnerable in the city. And I mean, even in our society, of course, we have a lot of them. So our starting point for the recovery is to take care that these kind of social problems would not get worse, at least not much.
Thank you. So talking about the most vulnerable, Anthony, I want to pivot to you to talk about another component of some of the equity conversations that's happening in cities, which is worker protections, particularly for gig workers, essential workers, and Lyft drivers are among those types of workers, being gig workers and essential workers. So there's a ballot initiative in California that Lyft is supporting that essentially takes on this question of whether workers should be classified as employees or independent contractors. The ballot initiative would make them independent contractors, and many critics are saying that this would block new labor protections for workers. What is Lyft's position now on Prop 22 and related positions for gig workers, and how, if at all, has that position changed during coronavirus when Lyft drivers became essential workers?
Yeah, I'll try to answer the question, and then also curious to maybe add a couple of thoughts on the last couple of questions as well. Yeah, we support Prop 22 because we think that while our drivers overwhelmingly, by a tune of 4-1, support maintaining their independence and their flexibility under the current model, we also know there are things that we could do if we created what I call a third way, which is somewhere between providing the flexibility, but also providing a safety net underneath drivers, things like a minimum earning, health care benefits, and other protections. And so the proposition actually would allow us to do that. So I'm encouraged by the support of the drivers. I'm also encouraged by the receptivity the people of California have, and I feel pretty good about our prospects in November. But this is a much longer conversation that we're having in the U.S. about work, and perhaps the gig economy and platforms like ours can begin to cut a path for a world in which individuals have maximum flexibility to work when and how they want to work, while having things like portable benefits and other safety net aspects that allow them to do that without falling below the safety net. So that's what our goal is. I have worked hard with labor and for labor in so many settings in my past life in government. And this is just an area where we have a disagreement about the path forward, but I actually think hopefully in the future, labor and groups like ours will lock arms and figure this out. On the larger question on the homelessness and the conversation you were having about rapid rehousing and housing first, I was a mayor a long time ago back in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we did some of this work as well. I have to say that I think one of the biggest challenges we have in the United States is we unlike and with great respect for what the mayor's doing over in Helsinki, our heterogeneity is a big challenge to us in the U.S. And I think that as we're talking about these trends around cities and growth and the future, we have to think in terms of also dealing with some of the racial challenges this country has, which I think stand in the way of us figuring some of these issues out.
Yeah, sorry, can you elaborate on what you mean? What do you think is different in the U.S. that would prevent the same strategy that was adopted?
Well, it's to some extent, it is the caricature of who's poor in this country. And it's the fact that in politics, the welfare queen is sort of the archetype of who's poor, when in fact, it isn't true statistically, and it's not true in terms of the demographic of poverty in our country. If we ever figured out that the economic interest of the underclass in the United States wasn't racial, it was more economic, and we figured out that it was something for us to really focus on, I think we would make a lot more progress.
Gotcha. Okay, so just viewing it through the lens of the economic needs rather than the racial needs. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, let's try to pivot to climate for just a little while. Vishan, you recently moved to the Bay Area in California, where unfortunately you were greeted by some pretty severe wildfires there and in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest, which has elevated a lot of questions, one of which is about how our built environment is prepared for climate change. In particular in California, there are entire communities that were constructed on areas that are vulnerable to fire destruction and arguably might never have been developed at all. Tell me how you think the region needs to change its policies to prepare for a future that likely includes more of these kinds of fires.
Well, my family was just recently evacuated from a fire. My wife is wondering what we're doing here. It is, look, and just to tie some of the comments together, we have too much sprawl in the Bay Area, and we have sprawl in what's known as the wildland interface, and so people build houses out in the woods. But what's interesting is wealthier people think sprawl is part of what happens with poor people, not just their big homes that are built out in the woods that shouldn't be out in the woods. And so I think this question of race and class that was just brought up is so critical, because it is the undercurrent of every single one of these public policy discussions. And unless we understand that, we are never going to get to the right policies. We clearly need to ban sprawl in the Bay Area, but that also means the communities are going to have to get desegregated. We're going to need investment in public infrastructure and social infrastructure, which means we have to get over those kind of racial hurdles that we have. So these things are all tied together, and I couldn't agree with that more.
Great. So thank you for your short answer. That means I can get the mayor to jump in here one more time and talk about your own climate goals. So you've set dramatic goals for emissions reduction, particularly around coal. You've said that you'll reduce your use of coal in heating by 2035. Even though you don't know yet how you'll do that, what made you decide to make that pledge, not knowing if you could get there? Just briefly, what steps are you taking to get closer to that reality, Mayor?
Actually, we have committed to become carbon neutral by 2035. And in order to do that, we need to get totally rid of coal by 2029. And actually, I even know how to do that, but I'm not pleased with the solution. So we could have done the same than many other European cities, that we replace coal by biomass, but I don't think it's a truly sustainable solution in the long run. And that's why we have invited the whole world to a Helsinki Energy Challenge, a €1 million competition in order to find the best solution how to replace coal. And I think the brilliance in the competition is that I don't know whether it will solve our problem or not, but I'm sure that it will contribute to the solving of that problem in tens or hundreds of cities in the world.
Okay,
and
well,
then I have the fallback position that I can't replace coal by biomass if I don't get any good idea from the rest of the world.
Fair enough, you have a backup plan. That's fair. Well, I think we can all end this panel by committing to keep and watch on the results of that competition so that we can all steal some of your ideas. We're going to need them here in the US as well. We're going to wrap it up there, but thank you all for just raising the tip of so many important issues that hopefully folks can go and read more on after this. I learned quite a lot from this, so thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Schala, and I'm the founder and CEO of Delos and the founder of the International Well Building Institute, headquartered here in New York City. As a native New Yorker, I've watched New York bounce back time and time again, and I've witnessed the fundamental shifts across industries that have been born of local crises. As you're about to hear from these extraordinary leaders in New York City policy and real estate, public confidence is fundamental to the economic recovery of this city. While the notion of wellness real estate first emerged from companies such as Delos and the introduction of the well building standard several years ago, COVID-19 has brought about a sudden awareness for all of us. One simple understanding that what surrounds us matters. What we touch matters, what we breathe matters, and how we gather indoors matters. The fundamental relationship between the built environment and the human condition has never been more apparent. Our real estate is and will be the largest carrier of a pathogen load such as this, whether it's COVID-19 or another risk we may see in the future. The Well Building Standard is a third-party certification platform that over the last 5 years has become the world's leading certification body for healthy buildings, with certifications now in 64 countries approaching 1 billion square feet across tens of thousands of buildings. Our latest program, the Well Health Safety Rating, is a third-party document review of any organization or facility's operational protocols as it pertains to health and safety. It's been drawn from insights and a governance process of over 500 virologists, public health experts, and building scientists, and led by former US Surgeon General Richard Carmona as part of the International Well Building Institute's Global Task Force on COVID-19. The Well Health Safety Rating is being applied to buildings of every type across the world by leading organizations right here in New York City, including several of the world's leading financial institutions, Fortune 500 companies, and small businesses alike, and on buildings such as the Empire State Building and iconic venues like Yankee Stadium, who both recently achieved the Well Health Safety Rating. The Well Health Safety Seal on the front entrance of any facility, restaurants, hotels, schools, offices, stadiums, stores, is fast becoming a common symbol and a consistent symbol of health and safety in the spaces we use every day. We're also proud to bring over 8 years of research at Delos to help with air filtration solutions for the New York City public school systems, particularly during this time, having already sent 30,000 highly efficient units to school classrooms across the 5 boroughs. As a proud sponsor of the City of Tomorrow event here at the 92nd Street Y, I want to commend the organizers at 92Y and 100 Stories for bringing together this event and offering us all a chance to collectively address this critical moment in our history. Thank you for the opportunity, and New York's best days are definitely still ahead.
Welcome to our Bringing New York Back panel as part of 92Y's City of Tomorrow Summit. We're joined today by a great panel of 3 individuals with lots of experience here in New York to help us to understand what exactly the challenges that our city are facing are, and what we can do to try to address those challenges. And I think given that we only have 30 minutes, we should just dive right in. So I'm going to ask a question to the three of you, and maybe each of you can start by answering the question in turn. The theme of this panel is bringing New York back, which implies that New York needs to be brought back. If you read in the newspaper or listen to some, you may believe that New York is on the verge of disappearing as a city, that we're never going to have office workers in New York again. Nobody's ever going to ride the subway again. Everyone's moving out. And crime in the meantime is going to be at record highs. And many of these things, I think, are indicative of true problems that we're facing. But I'm not sure that the reality necessarily matches the hype in current conversation. And so I guess the first question I'd like to ask of each of you is, from your perspective, where exactly is New York right now in this moment of crisis? What is real from your perspective? What should we be concerned about? And where do you think maybe the hype has gotten beyond reality? And maybe Kathy, I'll start with you. And if you can just very quickly introduce who you are, that would be great.
Hi, Kathy Wild, and I'm President and CEO of the Partnership for New York City, which is city's business leadership organization. So in terms of where we are, the impact of the COVID has been substantial. We have almost 1 million people that lost their jobs during the pandemic. We have a 16% plus unemployment rate, which is double the nation. We have seen serious damage to our small business community, our hospitality and tourism industry. At the same time, our key sectors, our major sectors that have kept this economy going, finance, media, real estate, and the technology sector, have all switched to working remotely, being able to keep these business operations going. So we have a much stronger underlying economy than most other cities in the world. We have the demonstrated ability to be resilient. So I think we're in overall long term. I have no doubt about the rebound of New York. Short term, we've got very serious challenges.
And let me just pick up on something that you raised and maybe turn Scott next to you. You'll introduce yourself in a second, but you are the CEO of a company that owns a significant amount of commercial real estate. And Kathy talked about the switch to remote work. What do you think is going on in terms of the workplace today, and how do you see that playing out over the long run?
Yeah, so I'm Scott Reckler, and as Seth said, I'm CEO and chairman of a real estate company called RXR, one of the largest real estate companies in the New York metro area, and I'm also chairman of the Regional Plan Association. I just want to pick up on Kathy's point, and then I'll come to you, to your point, Seth, which is, I think that I agree with Kathy that long term New York has proven resilient. We came into this strong, and then we come out the other side, we should also be strong. But I think we can't have a foregone conclusion that we're going to all of a sudden have a vaccine and then we're going to turn on the light switch and then New York is back. Because the longer that we go with the New York sort of being on pause and people are working from home and our economic ecosystem isn't coming together, the more damage we're doing to our economy, the more scarring, the more loss of jobs, the more fiscal challenges that we're going to have to recover from. So I think the real the question is how extended this downturn will be and how difficult it will be to climb out of it if we don't actually get New York reopened again. And and part of the work from home, and there's a whole element of this related to thinking about long term. There's going to be a structural work from home, which I think is remote working has come out. The genie's left the bottle, and I think there's some productivity and quality of life benefits to that will be integrated into the workforce. But there's also another implication, which is that we're social animals, and people realize that you need to be working in an office to really engage and come together, be mentored, be part of a broader community. But there's also a civic responsibility to this, which is that for every one office worker, there's 5 service jobs. So it's the restaurateur, it's a dry cleaner, it's the pharmacy, it's the florist. And that is really the risk here, because the big companies that Kathy was referring to and occupy our buildings, they have the staying power. They'll last 12 months, 24 months. What's really the people who are going to suffer are the small businesses, are the non-for-profits, is the municipal workers, because the fiscal challenges we're going to face. So it's impacting the hard-working men and women that really have drive the day-to-day part of our economy, are the ones that are going to be hit the worst out of this, which is why I think it's incumbent upon us to put a plan together where people feel comfortable coming back to the workplace safely and responsibly, and engaging with our local restaurants and stores to help getting this economy moving again before it gets worse than it already is.
And I want to come back in a minute with all of you to the point about the recovery and a plan. But Sarah, maybe just to turn to you, you focus on lots of aspects of the city, but transportation in particular is an area that you're focused on. And one of the things that I know we hear at the 92nd Street Y among our employee base, and from everything that I hear from other people that I speak to, this is a pretty consistent message, is that there's a real concern around going back to work, coming back to the city because of our transportation system, whether it's buses or subways or trains. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe help to frame the picture, again, in terms of what you think is real and what you think might be more hype about with respect to our transportation system.
Sure, thank you, Seth. And by way of introduction, I am Sarah Kaufman, the Associate Director of the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation. So as Kathy and Scott voiced, New York City is kind of in limbo right now, and the same is true for the transit system. During this spring, during what we may call the first wave of COVID in the city, transit ridership declined about 90%. It's starting to rebound. It's most recently reached about 30% of ridership from last year, from the same time last year, which incidentally is about double the number of people flying. The thing is about transit that there's a perception that it's dangerous for fear of spread of disease. However, studies here in New York, as well as in other major cities, including Paris and Tokyo, show that transit is not actually a major spreader of disease. So the perception is worse than the reality here. The more urgent problem in terms of transit is the absence of funding, which has been lacking from both the fare box and the federal government. And as a result of this lack of funding, we'll see some service interruptions and mechanical failures. The people who will be suffering the most, like Scott was saying, are the essential workers. These are the people who've continued to ride the subway throughout the pandemic. But when we start to have hospital staff and grocery workers and mail delivery people who can't get to work on time because of transit delays, that's where New York will suffer most from transit outages.
And I guess a question for the three of you. Each of you seems to paint a picture of a city that's facing real and significant challenges, but also a gap between the perception and reality. In many cases, a perception being worse than the reality that currently exists. From your perspective, why do you think there is that gap between perception and reality? Why are people so certain that the city is in one place when in reality it may be in a different place?
I think the primary reason is we have a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a psychological crisis. And the third one really depends on having very strong leadership and a clear plan for how everybody is going to get out of this. Not just the economic recovery, but how individuals have lost their jobs, what Where do they go for help? What is the support structure for the not-for-profit community? Will we have enough food? Will families have enough food to eat? I mean, we've got a whole range of this crisis has affected every sector of our society, and the impact in terms of raising people's level of anxiety has been huge. And of course, having the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter crisis come on top of that has just made that so much worse. So it's the psychology, and that's why our fears are exaggerated. Our worst case scenarios tend to come to front of mind, and that's the real challenge that we have to get through.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that something, which is that, I think in different times when we've been through crisis, and just, I use 9/11 as a example, right? That was obviously really traumatic. We lost a lot of loved ones in New York. But the way we reacted to that was different, right? We reacted to that it was almost a patriotic duty and to pay respects for what happened, that we were going to actually go on and rebuild and put a plan forward of how we were going to move forward, even though we knew we had to coexist with this new threat of terrorism that we didn't have to do before. But we had leadership and a plan that was put forward, how we're going to move that forward, that gave us comfort to recalibrate our lives to now adjust to thinking about that risk and getting back on airplanes and in public places and into buildings. And it feels, as it relates to this virus, we've almost surrendered to it, right? That we're going to wait at home and hope there's going to be a vaccine, and then we're going to start again. When it's not the reality, is that we really need a plan and infrastructure that's put in place that helps us coexist with this virus. Because it's not, even if we have a vaccine, this could be 2 or 3 years where we have to learn to move out and move around and get things moving again. And so if you think past 9/11 again, infrastructure was put in place relative security. Remember, we had the codes on high alert days that now even we had yesterday or the day before the governor announced something similar. We need an infrastructure that people can follow, that give people comfort, and then planning that give people certainty. Like if you looked at now what's happened with outdoor dining, what a great treat for New York, but you've given restaurants a set of guidelines. Their entrepreneurial spirit came out, their innovation came out, and they're making that work. You need planning for things like opening schools early. Like we began to plan about opening our office buildings on March 6th. March 6th is when we began to say, how are we going to bring people back safely, right? You need plans, and uncertainty when you have a psychology of fear that Kathy described, which I totally agree with right now, just adds and then actually augments that sense of fear and anxiety.
And just picking up on that, maybe Sarah, over to you. Again, one area that very clearly has a lot of fear attached to it is transportation and the subways, especially. And I think I read over the last couple of days that right now ridership is about 30% of what it would have been in a normal October. I guess that's better than the 10% we were at, but it's a lot worse than 100%. As you listen to Scott and Kathy talking about this psychological barrier that we're facing in our recovery, and you think specifically about the subway, which in a lot of ways is the veins that carry the blood of the city through it. What do you think we could be doing, or our leaders could be doing, to overcome that psychological hurdle when it comes to transportation?
That's a great question. And Scott, I'm so glad you brought up looking back at 9/11, because back at that point, I remember people saying, nobody's ever going to get on a plane again. Nobody's ever going to go into an airport again. And lo and behold, airline usage just kept growing afterwards. Similarly, people have been saying nobody's going to get on a subway again. And I think it's only a matter of time. Once we see workplaces, schools, recreation, theater, all of these places fully reopen, people will start taking the subway again, because it is the best way to get around the city. What we can be doing right now, and I do want to commend the MTA for getting the messaging out about using masks, is I think that we can see some elected officials riding transit to help demonstrate how safe it is. And we can also have some more publicity about how riding transit is the best way to get around the city. and not private vehicles, as many people have taken to.
I want to again build on something that you were just talking about. So we were talking about transportation as being an obstacle to recovery. Another area that people seem to have focused on has been the deterioration or perceived deterioration in quality of life. That may have been starting even before COVID-19, but certainly people have been talking about it since the pandemic. And Kathy, your organization helped to organize a letter to the elected leaders of the city talking about some of the concerns about quality of life. Can you talk maybe a little bit for the benefit of our viewers about what was in that letter and what you were hoping to achieve with it?
So 170 CEOs, major employers, including Scott, above, signed a letter to the mayor expressing, one, the commitment of employers to the city and to their willingness to be helpful in developing a plan for recovery, but also concerned about the immediate conditions and deterioration of the city, particularly in the area of security and crime, where there's we haven't mentioned that enough in this conversation so far, that really has been over the summer, as we saw the shootings rise, violent crime increase. That has been had a major impact on people's fear that we're going back to a city that is dirty and not well managed, et cetera. And there just hasn't been the kind of response, the obviously very much complicated by the racial tensions over the Black Lives Matter issues, where the police were kind of put on the defensive, and all of us didn't know quite how to respond to this. And it finally seemed like we just had to say something about that, and about, again, why we need a plan, why we need clear direction for the city, a clear vision of where we're going on all these challenges, whether it's homelessness or it's keeping the city clean and safe. These are challenges that we just have to tackle head on, and instead of reacting to each day's tabloid headline or the crisis du jour, we really have to get much more proactive. And there was a general feeling among business, and I have learned from every sector I've heard from in response to reading the letter, they basically said, you're right, we need a clear vision, and we need to feel how we can all participate in bringing the city forward. And that's really what we were looking for.
And out of curiosity, what has the response been from the mayor to that letter?
Well, the first response was that if he only had more money, if he could borrow $5 billion, and if we would help him get money from Washington, and we have been working on getting money from Washington, but most of the business community do not see the immediate problem of the city as money. It's really management and what's the plan.
And Scott, you were a signatory of that letter. What was it that led you to think that was the right way to get the attention of the elected leaders? And what do you hope that the elected leaders will take from the receipt of that letter?
And so, I think, in fairness to Kathy too, because I think one of the drivers of the letter was Kathy's organization, people in Kathy's organization, other business leaders and civic leaders have been engaged with City Hall and early on in this process, and making recommendations and working on trying to find ways that we can be in partnership with them, positioning the city to reopen and ensuring public safety and services. And most of it went to deaf ears, right? And a lot of ideas were just put on shelves after a lot of people provided input. And so that's a frustration that I think, to me, boils over. But to the public safety issue is a very big issue, right? And people look and say, and the mayor has said, well, we're nowhere near where we were in the early 90s, which is true, except we definitely have ramped up from where we were last year. And when it comes to public safety, perception is reality, right? If people are afraid to come back to the city because of public safety issues, they're not going to come back. And frankly, anecdotally from my own company, from talking to my tenants, they've all had incidents with public safety over the last number of weeks. So, but one of the challenges of public safety, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg theory, right? Because the more we can bring people back to come and occupy our parks, occupy our streets, occupy our squares, the less likely you're to have people there that are up to no good, right? And so we need to bring people back, but they need to feel safe coming back along the way. And so I think we have to keep, pushing that message, but in partnership with the city, and making sure that police know that they're trusted and by us and by the city, but also they have to earn the trust on the counter in terms of that when there are bad acts that they have to take action to get rid of them. But this has been a great police force, and we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
And Sarah, just picking up on what Kathy and Scott were just talking about, again, coming back to transportation. So, this is another area where, as we've established, the perception doesn't necessarily match the reality. But to Kathy's point about money, there is a real money issue that our transportation systems are facing. And I guess from your perspective, how likely is it that the transportation system is going to get the funding that it needs from Washington? And if it doesn't, what's likely to happen to our transportation system going forward?
I think it's pretty likely that we'll get some benefit from Washington. I mean, the transit agencies across this country are basically asking for less funding than the airlines are at this point, and we carry about double the number of passengers every year, or every day. So the likelihood of funding comes from the fact that New York is probably the most important economic driver in this country, and if Washington wants to continue that economic activity, it will subsidize getting our workers to the offices or to their places of work every single day. And we can't do that without transit. If the funding doesn't come in, we will see a real loss of productivity, a loss of economic activity, and really the entire economy of the nation will suffer as a result.
And let me pick up on this question of money, and maybe I know we're running short on time, and there's a final question I want to make sure to ask of all of you, but maybe just for Kathy and Scott, a quick question for you. So it sounds like there are a number of problems that our city is facing, some of them real, some of them perception. There seems to be a leadership issue that we're dealing with. But money also is short right now, and both the city and state budgets are very, very tight. I hear from people statements along the lines of, well, it's not just that we're short of money, but that the money that we have, we don't spend really effectively. But even if we were to spend more effectively, it's likely that city and state government are going to need more resources in order to get through this period. Borrowing has been one thing that's been proposed. Higher taxes are another. I guess for both of you, where do you stand on the question of whether taxes should be raised? And if so, what would the right taxes to raise be?
Well, from our standpoint, the first thing we have to do is identify, one, right now, we do not have a budget crisis. We've got a need to reduce spending. But we've got enough money right now in city and state government to get through the end of the year. So that's with savings that will not wipe us out. It's just got to be smart spending cuts. In terms of looking over the next couple of years, if we have, as Scott pointed out earlier, if we have a sustained problem this year, it's projected that our GDP will go down 12.9%. That's going to leave a huge hole in our economy that's going to be magnified next year and the year after, most likely. So yes, we are going to need to raise revenues. Charging the 118 billionaires a wealth tax is not going to do that. They'll just leave. So if we want to raise revenues, we have to think about ways that are practical and really going to work. And I think that we're capable of doing that. But the important thing is have a plan, see what it's going to cost to prevent people from being, when the eviction moratorium ends, which it must do at some point, what happens with their back rent and how are we going to deal with that challenge? What about the small businesses' back rent? How are we going to deal with that challenge? We've got to look at those. When we have a compelling plan, I am confident we will rise to the occasion and find the money to pay for it, just as we have in the past.
Yeah, and I'm just building again on what Kathy said. first on the management side, because just to crystallize the point about efficiency, in the last year of the Bloomberg administration, their budget was $68 billion. The last budget put forward by Mayor de Blasio was $88 billion. So there's a $20 billion difference in budget, and I would just say I don't see a $20 billion benefit of services and quality of life that we're facing in our city. So there has to be a more efficient and effective way to do this. So while we need money, and simultaneously, I think we need to be focusing on simultaneously how we're going to actually manage our city better going forward. And I think that's got to be part of the plan, to Kathy's point, that you put forward, because I think a lot of New Yorkers get frustrated putting money into a black hole and they don't know where it goes, and they feel they're not getting the bang for the buck. The other thing I would say with a plan, if you really want to do a plan that I think makes sense, I would circle the amount that we think we need, and I would create a more finite tax. So it's a year or two of whatever that is to fill a hole, versus a sustainable tax that's going to impact the long-term cost of living in New York. I think people are going to be much more comfortable saying, when you have a COVID recovery fee, or whatever you want to call it, that we're funding for the next year or two, but then that goes away. That feels a little bit different.
We are the highest taxed place in the country, competing heavily with California, but we already are there. We need to be competitive over the next few years if we're going to bring back 1 million jobs, and raising taxes goes the other direction.
I guess it's good to know that we're still #1 in something.
Many things, and many.
Yeah. So I think we're down to just a couple of minutes, and so I guess what I'm going to do is throw out one last question that I would ask of each of you. The opening remarks, I think all three of you indicated that over the long term, you're optimistic about the future of New York. So I guess just to close out our conversation, if you could look forward 3, 5, 7 years, whatever the right amount of time is, at the recovered version of New York, how do you think that new New York looks? And in what ways is it maybe even better than the New York that we all lived in 8 months ago, before this crisis hit us? And I'll start with you, Sarah.
Thanks, Seth. I think that something we haven't talked about yet that I love to see is something that's grown out of the pandemic is a renewed appreciation for our street space. We're starting to use it with 10,000 restaurants that have outdoor dining. We're seeing record numbers of bike ridership. City Bike hit 2.5 million rides last September. People are starting to use streets for more human scale activities rather than vehicles alone. So people are using them for sitting, for dining, for art and performances. Streets have become a community space, and especially a socially distant gathering space for people who may not have access to parks. So I would love to see, in just a few years, to see much of the city enjoying public space together as a community.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Kathy?
I hope we'll be a more affordable city, that this is going to force us to figure out how to curb not just public spending, but figure out how to get hold of some of the speculative costs, whether it's in real estate, construction, other areas that have made it so expensive to live or do business here. I think that would be a great outcome of this very difficult experience.
And Scott, I guess you get the last word.
Yeah, okay. I would say just two things I'll focus on. One is, I think, taking a more of a regional view of our city and thinking about ways that we can leverage the region to actually create more affordability, distributed workforce, take some congestion off our streets, capacity in our subway systems and our transit systems along the way. I think would be very positive coming out of this. And then the last one I would say is that we all come together and realize we're in this together. I mean, I know we've been talking a lot about the elected officials, but business people, civic leaders, we all have to solve this problem together. It's not going to be solved by our elected officials, and we all have to be committed to lead by example, support our local businesses, download the New York COVID app that I know Kathy's been promoting, we're promoting to do this so that everyone can have the track and tracing, and find ways to coexist and rebuild a better, stronger, more equitable New York.
Well, thank you very much. That's an optimistic note to end on. It sounds like we have a period of challenges in front of us, but in the long run, we have a strong city that will emerge from all of this even stronger. So I want to just thank, on behalf of the 92nd Street Y and all of our viewers, Sarah, Kathy, Scott, and I'll look forward to continuing this conversation very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A very good morning. I'm David Vanderleer. I'm a cultural forecaster and I work mainly with cultural institutions around the world. Many of us live in New York because it's such an amazing place because of all the cultural institutions. But of course, this year is a super weird year. And normally you're constantly trying to figure out where do I go tonight because there's so much going on, but there's hardly anything going on this year. I'm joined here today by 5 amazing panelists, each leading a different cultural institution here in the city, different audiences, different content, but I have a strong hunch that you're struggling through exactly the same issues this year. So I'm very eager to chat to you and to hear what you're working through. And I have a feeling a lot of that will, of course, be short-term focused. But I also believe that this is a time where many of you are thinking about what could be happening within your institutions in the long run. What type of opportunities does this wild time of like big challenges also create? So with that, let's kick it off. Welcome to all of you. We'll do a quick loop around the room. And Brian, we'll start it with you. The question to you is, who are you? Where do you work? And very important to know, why do you think it's important to work in cultural institutions?
Thank you, and good morning. I'm Brian Jones. I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, part of the New York Public Library. Why do I think it's important to work in cultural organizations? Well, I think cultural organizations help us to think about who we are on a grander scale. And they have a unique way of helping us tell stories about ourselves. And I work at a world-renowned Black history library. And I can't tell you how fortunate I feel to be in that library at a moment like this, thinking about the meaning of Black history for our city and our country and our world at this moment.
Very good. Seth, over to you.
Thank you so much and good morning. I'm Seth Pinsky. I'm the CEO of the 92nd Street Y. I am welcoming all of you today from the 92nd Street Y. Hopefully more of you will be able to join us here at some point in the not too distant future. The reason why I work in the cultural sector and the reason why I think it's important for us is really threefold. I've always been personally passionate about the arts. I feel that the arts and culture are what bind us together. They're what make life worth living. They enrich us. And I think that at a moment like this, when so many of us are so isolated from one another, all of those things are more important than ever. My background also is in economic development. I worked for a number of years in the Bloomberg administration. And what I also came to appreciate in that role was the fact that the arts are not only a major employer in and of themselves, an important part of our city's economy, but they're also part of what I like to call our magnetic infrastructure. The infrastructure in a place like New York that attracts people to live here, and in turn serves to give the city its great competitive advantage, this incredible workforce that we have here. And so I think for all of those multiple reasons, this is a sector that all of us as New Yorkers should really care about. And it's one that I'm thrilled to be a part of and that I'm looking forward to discussing today.
Very good, and thank you for hosting. Louise, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm Louise Mirror, and I have the great pleasure and privilege of being president and CEO of the New York Historical Society. Culture is wonderful. I am very, very fortunate to work at a cultural institution that tells history. It may sound banal, but I'll say it anyway. If you don't know where you've been, it's hard to know where you're going and where you are. And culture gives context, but it also gives joy. And it is a joy to me to bring joy to other people.
I'm happy that you immediately throw in history. Very good. Max.
Hi, thanks, and hello everyone. My name is Max Hollein. I'm the director of the Metropolitan Museum. On a personal level, I've been involved with cultural institutions from the very beginning. I got schlepped into museums as a young child when I certainly didn't want to go into museums, and that kind of then obviously led to something else. I would say, in a general level, I think it is great to work in cultural institutions. To have a voice in the cultural discussion, and on the other hand, like what the Met is, it's really a memory institution. So you look back into the past, like Louise has also suggested, and I think also Brian and also Seth, of course. But you also have a moment, especially when we have a reckoning with history, and you're part of that complexity that surfaces then, so to say, a lot more answers, but I think also a lot more questions. So that's a very energizing and invigorating space to be in. And then I have to also say, I just love to work in institutions that are also being loved, and that really people are excited to come to, and they have a passion to do so. It's a very gratifying place to be.
Very good. And last but not least, Eduardo.
Thank you. I'm Eduardo Valaro, the Artistic Director and CEO of Ballet Hispanico. I am so fortunate to have been an artist. I danced with the company for many years, and now I'm leading this organization in many different ways. And I'm so honored to be doing that at this time also, because the work that this organization has been doing has been so important. And now our voices as a BIPOC organization, it's important to have that. I do want to say that I think that, our organizations are important because they are the temples of our cultural consciousness. And it includes the history, and I love that, but I just want to say that it gives our youth and our futures a path forward.
Very good. We spread it, or we have the whole gamut already in just a few minutes. Of course, this has been a very difficult year for all of you, and I'm sure that your jobs are very different from what you thought it would be a year ago. Many of you have been working through reopening. And Louise, perhaps I can start with you, and perhaps you can tell us, like, why is it so important that cultural institutions are opening up again? And with opening up, what is different for you?
Yeah, well, we reopened about a month ago with an outdoor exhibition, so people seem to be more comfortable outdoors than indoors, and now we've reopened indoors as well. You know, everybody has said this in one way or another already, but New York is so much about culture. And whether there are tourists here or not, there are New Yorkers who have been literally starving for cultural experiences over the last 6 to 7 months. So just as it is important for New York to be open, it is important for us to be open as cultural institutions, to the extent that we can welcome people, to the extent that we can satisfy that thirst for what we offer, and to the extent that we can say New York is back. You know, we're here, we've survived, and we're doing as well as we can. Thank you. It is really important. And our experience is, well, we all know we're limited in the capacity of visitors we can welcome, but we're at that capacity, and I think that probably characterizes most, if not all, cultural institutions. So there's a message there.
Absolutely. And Seth, you have seen a giant growth, I think we can easily say, in your digital footprint in the last few months. What does it mean for you to reopen physically again? Because you also did.
Well, the past several months have been difficult for us, as they've been for everyone. We, like so many other organizations, have had to make some very hard decisions, whether it be with respect to personnel or programming. But one of the decisions that we made early on that has been an important one for us was that our decision was that we were going to lean into the crisis. And so we, over the course of roughly a weekend, moved almost all of our programming online and have basically been active in terms of that programming to the same extent that we were beforehand, just everything was virtual. Over the last month to month and a half, we've begun welcoming people back into the building. And that's important for a variety of reasons. First of all, the economics of doing work in person are very different from the economics of doing work online. And I think for all of our institutions, this has been a very difficult period from a financial perspective. I also think as a community and cultural center, the connections that you can create online are really amazing. The fact that now we're reaching millions of people instead of the hundreds of thousands of people that we used to reach, and that those millions of people are no longer just in New York, but all over the world, is incredibly encouraging. But there's something about face-to-face interaction, even if it's behind masks and distanced at least 6 feet apart from one another, that can't be replaced. And so bringing people back together into those in-person communities, I think is symbolically important, as Louise was saying, but also just important in terms of restoring a sense of normality into people's lives and making people feel those connections again that many of us have felt so separated from during this period of social isolation. So the new rules are challenging. They're difficult to operate under. I'm sure we'll hear more about this from the other panelists. But it's a very important moment, I think, for us as an institution, and it's a very important moment for New York as a city.
Absolutely. Max, looking at what has happened over the last half year, I think there's many underlying problems, not in your particular case, perhaps, although I'm sure there are also, but that have been hitting cultural institutions that to perhaps some of the outsiders may look very surprising, but to many of you in institutions, you probably saw some of these things coming. And I'm wondering if you could talk us through, like, what were these underlying problems that we see surfacing so quickly in cultural institutions at the moment?
Well, I think you see a whole set of issues, of course. And first of all, I also think that these last couple of months were for sure full of challenges. So when you just spoke about opportunities, I would see, like, let's focus on challenges as well, because that's really, and then yes, there are some opportunities. I think that there is, in general, I would say, this whole, the last couple of months showed also that I would say both in the US in general, but I think also in certain areas, there has to be a different kind of almost like memory culture and a reckoning with the past in the US. And that I think that wasn't that developed maybe beforehand. And we have to also look at ourselves. We are a memory institution, so we have to address that. We have to properly address that. I think also what the time has taught us in a very almost like a way that we had to first realize, sometimes even shamefully, that to fully understand what it means to be anti-racist and why we are just simply not yet an anti-racist institution, or even as an individual don't really act that way. I think that's something that really surfaced as a matter of not only being appalled about discrimination, but actually what not only can you do, but what do you have to do as an institution and as well as an individual. I think, again, that's something that certainly kind of surfaced to the top. And then on a more, I would say, practical level, it clearly also showed, in general in New York, but of course also for cultural institutions, how dependent we are on tourism, on a certain level of visitorship, and how our revenue model is sometimes kind of geared towards that. And again, that of course creates a certain level of issues. And then I would say the last thing that I want to say about this is that the last couple of months brought to surface things that we were already worried about. as a global citizen before. The rising amount of nationalism, xenophobia on the rise, borders being put up, restrictions of travel, all of that basically put almost like the idea, the positive things about global at risk. And in that sense, it kind of opened our eyes about, okay, we can't take all of this for granted. We need to actually work for it, and now probably not more than ever. So as an institution, I see it as a real, not only challenge, but actually a mandate to be a really institution for the world and around in the world in that kind of sense, and fight against some of these issues that have surfaced before, and that means both locally but also internationally. And that's, I think, showed us on a one hand a full set of challenges, but also it galvanized us more about what is this institution, or what are these institutions really about, and how do they really serve the public and society.
I think you make so many important points, perhaps for the sake of the conversation, because we will not be able to work through each of them, right? Although I'm sure many of them will be coming back. I do want to linger on the points you're making about racism, because it has been really interesting to look at like what is happening in cultural institutions. And Brian, I hope you can help me answer this. It's like, I've been wondering, why did so many cultural institutions take so long to act and did not act better around issues of diversity and equality? And I wonder, like, one, from within your institution, but also looking at a larger landscape, what your take on this is?
Well, yeah, it has taken a long time to have a conversation, and by some reckoning, it's taken 400 years to have a conversation. So yes, a long time. I think this current reckoning shows us just how recurring the dynamic is, that this change comes from the bottom up, that it's people, usually at the bottom, who grab hold of the institutions and by the lapels and shake them into trying to do something different. And so, yes, at the highest levels, it's not surprising that all of our institutions are slower to respond, slower to change, and that sort of thing. And it's the changes that are happening now are welcome. I will say that even the New York Public Library, the Schomburg Center itself is actually a product of this dynamic, that actually was librarians and community members who had the vision that a branch library should become a Black History Research Center. And it was their initiative that brought it into being. So the Schomburg Center comes from this kind of bottom-up history of trying to change the narrative and trying to make space. I'm filling in here for our director, Kevin Young. Something he often says is that we're trying to create spaces for people to transform. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what people are asking of us. They're asking of us to do better, to see clearer. But it's thanks to their initiative that we are now having these conversations and pursuing these changes.
Yeah, I've always liked it about cultural institutions, that they give you the opportunity, like if they're doing their work well, for all of us to see the world differently, right? So that's like, there's so much opportunity there. But not always easy, obviously. We'll come back to this topic in the larger discussion, Brian. I do want to linger also on another item that Max is bringing up around revenue models. And Eduardo, I know that you have been seeing quite a shift in also your income as an institution. And perhaps you can tell us about like the financial impact on your institution has meant that you see a lot of your work change drastically. What do you see as a recovery path? We can't hear you.
There, I just ruined that rule. Well, first I want to say that we're a dance organization, and a dance organization is about full corporal integration into the art form, which means we will be the last type of organization to really come on. We're trying some things. We went immediately virtual and developed a virtual platform, much more not about the economic issue that we were having, but rather about the people issue that we're going to need to stay connected to a community that is usually marginalized, right? And so we were going to need to keep this voice and this work going. So it was important for us to become virtual. I can tell you that for us, I've been now the director and CEO for 11 years. And those years we were able to exponentially grow. And so we went below half again to where I started when I started. So we lost all the growth that we had, which is major for an organization that supports children of color and that gives opportunities and has been giving it for 50 years. So that's why we decided to go virtual. But what we've learned is, again, I think someone already said it, the ability to reach and have a larger footprint with your impact in the communities you already have a footprint and then beyond is really remarkable. I don't have an answer yet, but I think we will learn to use it as, and I don't want to call it another income generator because it is really a people generator. Mm-hmm. The virtual costs are not the same, you can't equate it. But we'll have an arm now, I think, as we move forward into the future, where we can reach even more of our community that maybe at some point we send a computer to if they don't have, and then join us. Here's how we can help you. Here's how we can give you this culture, this work, this art. And so I see us coming back slowly, much slower than most of these organizations. We don't house it. We are, again, the corporal art. So we must be presented. We must be in spaces. I think that will come back. It'll take time. We tour, the professional company tours a lot. So that will take time. But as we plan and look forward, we are certainly looking at how this footprint that we've developed so far virtually enhances the work that we'll continue to do.
Can I just jump in and make, sorry, one point. I want to just pick up on something that you said. You know, when we think about our online presence, which has grown incredibly, we've put on something like 1,500 online events since we closed our doors. I think we're almost at 4 million views. We've sold 50,000 tickets to various events, and 60% of those are to new patrons who had never done anything at the 92nd Street Y beforehand. When we think about that, we think about it in really two ways. One, as you were saying, it's a people generator. It's about expanding our reach and our impact. And I think that that's something that can't be minimized and is going to have an enormous impact on New York's cultural institutions, because I think all of us are realizing, I mean, you know, maybe the Met always has had a global footprint, but for a lot of us, we've been really focused on New York and New Yorkers, and suddenly we're realizing that we can touch people all around the world, which is incredible. But I also think that it's important not to minimize the financial piece of it. And I know it's a little bit of, you know, kind of the unspoken part of arts and culture, that there is a financial aspect to it. But I think you know, since we're talking here today in this summit about the future of cities and the future of New York, it's important to acknowledge the fact that there's a good chance that not every arts institution that was here in February is going to be here at the end of the pandemic. And the impact that this pandemic is having, especially on smaller and less well-capitalized organizations, is significant. And that's terrible for society, and it's terrible for New York and its long-term economic viability. And so I think it's important for all of us to also look at the financial piece of the online business, and not to view it as a profit-making business, because that's not what we do, but to think about ways in which we can turn it into part of the future economic package that supports us all. The concern that I have with a lot of arts organizations is that I see a reluctance to address the economic piece of the shift to online. And I worry about the analogy to what happened with the newspaper industry 10, 15 years ago, where the industry went online. It basically felt that it had to offer all of its content for free. And what you saw was this vicious downward cycle where the industry wasn't able to survive because it had to keep cutting resources, which made it less and less relevant. And we need, I think, as an industry to address that and to make sure that we're generating the revenues that we need in order for our businesses to remain sustainable over the long run. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about that. I think it's critical to our survival.
So let's play a little bit with this. I'm not quite sure if it's a full shift online. I think that would potentially be problematic. But I do think it's important to look at like different models, right? One thing that worries me in general, where institutions were coming from, but also especially about potentially more playing out online, is that I don't fully always believe there was a strong enough connection to the communities that an organization could and should be serving. So the question to all of you would be is like, okay, what are the responsibilities that you carry towards your local communities, but also when you're shifting or looking at a bigger online presence, how could you still create a sense of community on there?
I'm very happy to jump in. I think for probably all of us, one of our main audiences are young people, students in the New York City public schools specifically. And for a very long time, that has been, fully half of our visitors have been students who come as part of school groups in one way or another, or after school activities. And that is, that's an audience that I think we've been challenged to keep going with our remote programs, because you can't let young people down. You just can't do it. And obviously the public schools had to pivot very, very quickly in the direction of remote learning. And to the extent, and I'll speak for the New York Historical, to the extent that we have been a partner, a full partner in offering history education remotely, I think we've been, we've been very, very successful. Of course, the student population never addressed our financial needs or our business plans. So, that's almost something that one has to do irrespective of, the financial dimension. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that all of us have continued to serve to the best of our ability young people who are needful of cultural experiences, but also academic experiences, and we offer that through culture. I think as Seth says, this has been an opportunity to reach way, way beyond. We have an auditorium that seats 420 people. We have had programs with many thousands of attendees, but then again, not to harp on money, but we can't live without it. And truly, I think the challenge is to figure out how to monetize, crass as it sounds, that experience that over a period of half a year, most of us offered for free to all those great people. So let's hope now that we're charging something that they stick with us.
Maybe I can just add something. I think even if you talk about revenue, but let's even take this bigger picture. I think we have to all work on maintaining what New York represents to the world. Meaning it is of course a great city. It's a great city here in the US, but the reason why some of our institutions are here the reason why people want to come is because we represent something to the world, values. We represent an accessibility. We represent like a home away from home or whatever it is. And I think that's a really important piece of the whole equation. I was very surprised when we reopened the Met. It became international news. I mean, we were on TV, national TV in Japan, in Turkey, and wherever. And it dawned on me, well, the reason for it is, on the one hand, because it was one of the first good news out of New York for a lot of months that came out of there. So that was really significant. And on the other hand, because so many people associate themselves with New York and then also with the Met. Because in one way, if you go to Rome or to Paris or to Vienna, where I come from, you, as a tourist, you go there to visit the past, more or less. If you come to New York, you want to live in the present and you want to be in a city that really represents something for you. And so in that sense, we need to not only preserve that, but expand on that. I think that's, so to say, digital or physical, that's a real basis. And of course, there have been changes in regard to the perception of the US in the world in the last 4 years, I would say. I mean, having been in Berlin, when Barack Obama visited Berlin and 200,000 Berliners stood on the streets to welcome the US president, that's different right now. So in a certain way, we also have a responsibility to kind of make sure that New York, which is the basis for, is being seen as the city really as a global city for everyone, and as a platform where everybody wants to be associated with.
Yeah, I fully agree. And Max, I was wondering though, like coming back to the Met a few weeks ago, like I'd love to come more often, but I'm often a little overwhelmed by the tourists, so I don't come as often as I should. I'm very excited they're not there now, even though I shouldn't be. But I felt like, oh, it's finally for New Yorkers again. So I wonder, like, what it means when you're looking at your institutions. What does it mean to somehow be able to ground yourselves differently in the city also? Not only in this big picture that you're describing, which I agree is very important, but what opportunity is there to ground yourselves differently here at this point?
Well, obviously, percentage-wise, we have now a much more local, or almost like only local audience, which is a very different audience because these are repeat visitors, people who grew up with the institution. It's very different. There's a different dialogue going on. These are people who notice more or less every change in the galleries, things like that. So it's a much more two-way communication, and it's a different way of using the institution. And I think that's something that we really use right now. And it's also an audience that probably before the time of closure took the institution for granted. And to some extent they should. But then you noticed when like 6 months of closure, when they came back, they are now, I mean, the experience for everyone is so intense right now because they're not going through the galleries quickly. They stay there because they've missed it, but also they know, wow, something was taken away from me for quite some time. And so in that sense, we have to also work on keeping that excitement and that attention level up. And that's another so to say opportunity and a way to working with the local audience. And also, of course, like what Seth also kind of described, is kind of maintaining, I would say, a relationship also, probably through digital platforms and many other means, that goes way beyond the physical visit and starts way before that. So it's a kind of a much more holistic relationship with the institution per se, and that's building up right now.
Brian, Eduardo, do you see particular ways of grounding institutions? May not be your own, but in general around you?
Well, I would say for the Schomburg Center, similar to what Max is saying, the way that New York is a global city with obviously local people who live here. Similarly, Harlem is a global neighborhood. It's a place from and to which there's been a global discussion in the Black diaspora for a long time. And a lot of local artists and thinkers and writers have moved through and influenced the space and taken from it. Jacob Lawrence, Augusta Savage. I mean, there's a whole history of people who are resident in that neighborhood, working with and through that our institution. You know, I'm just hearing everyone talk, I'm remembering, oh yeah, we used to have dance parties at the Schomburg Center. We used to have dance parties. So people could come in and for a pretty low price, you didn't have to engage with the archives or the exhibits, you just dance. We were always trying to find ways to encourage people to walk in and participate and be in community with us in many different ways, whether they were more cerebral or more, as Eduardo might say, more corporal. But yes, I think we have in the Schomburg Center in particular, and perhaps as Max is saying about New York in general, a unique opportunity to be both very local and very global simultaneously.
Do you all think it's like there is an opportunity, perhaps not so much as of the situation now, but generally, to connect to everyday needs of your audiences more beyond the content needs of your audiences?
Yes, I'd like us to go just a little bit deeper in terms of what local means. Mm-hmm. And local is not just an audience, not saying that that's what was said, but local is also how you're communicating to that audience and bringing that audience into the decision making. I think we're at a point, right now that we have to reframe, reformat, rethink the way we do our work because it's being asked of us. And even in my organization, it's looking within first and saying, what are these structures that have been put in that keep my audience from participating, or keep another audience who is being marginalized here because of what, not only what we do, but how we price this. And so sometimes I think things aren't just about bottom line. And this, for me, virtual might be something that is not money making, and I embrace that, but will continue to help us reach targeted audiences. I think it's really an important time now to work with our local communities and bring their voices into the way we decide to continue to produce programming. I think that's what's a big thing that's been missing, and that can be done in many ways. I think the leadership and who people see, because if New York is so global, then we have to be a model. We have to be a model in the struggle right now for social justice. And unless we really take a look within ourselves and see where are those structures, and I think, you know, for me, it's everything from, you know, artist that walks in through the door to board member. And it's just a moment to really reflect so that then we can reframe how we are local and then global.
Mm-hmm. Eduardo, you used the word reframing, and that was actually going to be my last question, and looking at the time, that's probably a good one to put out there now. I'm sure you've all been looking at like what is going on within your institution, what your plans were and what they become now, but also wondering is like, oh my God, like if I could, like I would build a completely different institution. It may not be particularly this institution that you work in, but like what would be the new frameworks that you feel like, okay, this is the time to start developing those? And I wonder if you have been secretly toying with wild ideas about institutions of tomorrow.
Well, I could maybe I can start because it's obvious that if you are, since we are celebrating this year our 150th anniversary of the Met, and on the other hand we have a time where I would say it's being scrutinized more than ever before how we reflect on history, but also how we show history and how history is being represented in our institution. Now, obviously, if you would start from scratch, our institution would look very differently. The footprint, the allocation of which space for which collections where, or even how we show it. So in a certain sense, not that we are a time capsule, But the last 150 years of history and of perception of history, or of narratives, of course biased narratives or whatsoever, are baked into our institution. So in a certain sense, you need to almost like look at this, maybe like almost like an archaeologist, and you go layer by layer, and you need to make these layers transparent, but you can't take them away, because that's basically how the institution is built. But of course, if you would say, here's all the money that the Met received through philanthropy in the last 150 years, all in one pot, and here are all the works that we received in the last 150 years, and just start anew, it would look very different.
I'm sure. I would be very curious. Any other big ideas?
Yeah, so, well, this is not a big idea. I think, you know, at New York Historical, we've worked very hard to represent the diversity of the city and the diversity of the nation for a very long time. So, you know, we've truly focused on trying to be part of the history of the city and the nation and not apart from it. So I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't blow ourselves up. I'm very proud of what we've achieved, but I do want to say that moving forward, I think back again on the joy that I've experienced through my institution, and a lot of that has had to do with collaborations. And you know, I'm looking at Eduardo, and we've collaborated with you. I mean, we got this Picasso stage curtain, like, you know, a gift from the gods almost, and there were the dancers in our gallery celebrating along with us. We couldn't have done that ourselves. We don't have any dancers, you know, maybe we do among my colleagues, but not at that level. It was just a moment of such pure wonder for everyone who is in that gallery. We've obviously collaborated with the Schomburg to a tremendous extent. And, you know, with the Met, we did a big Tiffany, we have Tiffany lamps, we did a big Tiffany lamp show, and the Met, of course, has wonderful Tiffany windows and all sorts of other things. I think that one aspect, we're about to embark on a wonderful collaboration, an exhibition with the Asia Society Museum. I mean, one opportunity that we all have and we can look forward to is, and perhaps, you know, these past 6 months have taught us some lessons about collaboration. But I think one thing that we can look forward to is being enriched by the resources that we find in, if not in our neighborhoods themselves, within our neighbors in the city and elsewhere.
I love the sense of collaboration and partnership that you're bringing in. Very important. Yep.
I feel like I keep finding out more and more about the ripples of the WPA program, earlier part of the 20th century. And maybe this isn't an original idea, but it's seems like we need a stronger floor for arts and culture organizations and people, and for artists. And I think maybe if we're, as Seth is hinting, going into a time where, or discussing going into a time where those supports are being ripped away, you know, I welcome a discussion on figuring out a way to build in a stronger baseline for cultural workers, and therefore new opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get into the arts game because they don't come with those family resources. And I think that would create a new foundation for our institutions as well, reflecting, promoting, and hosting those works.
I would also, just building on that, I would say that you know, we're living in an era where in so many different ways our social fabric is being pulled apart. And I think that the role that we as arts institutions have is to try to reweave that social fabric and bring people together, understand where differences can be celebrated and also where the commonalities exist. And I think, again, to be able to combine the in-person experience of bringing people together with an online experience where you can knit even larger groups of people over larger geographies into a coherent whole is something that I would hope we be able to see come out of this experience, as difficult as it's been.
Yeah, fully agree, Seth. Eduardo, any secret dreams on your side?
No secrets, open books. So I want to just remind us that this pandemics have brought us together. And we're talking about, it really leveled the playing field. We're all talking, we're all working together. There is no small or big all of a sudden. And I'm hoping that in the future, it will remain this way. That there's kind of not only a democracy, but there is a coming together and working together to create a lot of what Brian just mentioned for cultural workers and how important that is. So I'm hopeful with that. I actually, for a dance organization, am really looking to the future of becoming and understanding that we are a resource organization, that we have histories of intersecting diasporas that you can see come live on a stage. So we are developing ways of doing that and programming of doing that. So that's what we're doing in my dance world.
I think that's a really good one to wrap it up with. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and it is time. Seth, I would like to thank you and Britta and Shannon for hosting us, and the panelists. Really appreciate you joining today, and I know that this is a very busy and tough time for each of you, but you're doing such hard work and such a good job, so I'm really looking forward to see how you will be continuously shifting the model. And thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Welcome to this conversation for the 92Y in Hearst. I'm Emily Tisch-Sussman, the host of your Presidential Playlist podcast, and excited to dive into a conversation about cities. I'm not a cities expert. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. So I feel like I have some lived experience around cities, but I'm excited to get into the conversation with the real experts and dig down into what we can understand, those of us who care about New York, who care about cities, what direction we're going in. It can definitely be easy to get bogged down into the conversation about like this technology, that technology, but we're really excited to talk with the experts we have here today to understand the big picture about where we should go, where we can go. So let's get right into it. So our first expert today, we have Jessica Rosenworcel, the Commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, and has over 2 decades of communications policy experience in public service. Welcome, Commissioner.
Thanks for having me.
Daniel Castro is the Vice President of Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and Director of their Center for Data Innovation, where he focuses on information technology. Welcome, Daniel.
Glad to be here today.
Dan Doctoroff is Chairman and CEO of Sidewalk Labs, which develops urban innovations. He previously served as President and CEO of Bloomberg LP and is New York City's Deputy Mayor for Economic Development under Mayor Bloomberg. Welcome, Dan.
Great to be here.
So Dan, I want to start with you, but the big question, look, you've spent many years working to help cities become more efficient, more responsive. Given where we are today, we are definitely not post-pandemic, we are probably mid-pandemic. So how do you see technology and innovation helping people return to cities and improving quality of life?
Well, first let me say, I think cities, many of them, New York included, are facing incredible challenges right now. And it's not just now, they're going to play out over the next several years. I really think there's a real risk if we aren't really thoughtful and smart and proactive of slipping into a 70s style vicious cycle where what you see is people and companies leaving the city, creating real budget issues, which means less investment in improving quality of life deteriorating and more people leaving, and on and on. That's what happened, for example, in New York in the 70s. We lost 800,000 people in 1 decade. We lost 13 Fortune 500 companies in 1 year. And you see evidence that that cycle is beginning now. and we've got to be really, really smart to stop it. The good news is that there is a set of technological, regulatory, financial, and other innovations that can help us really rethink the model of the city. But in order to do that, you have to understand what the problem is. And there's a bunch of them. The biggest problem we face right now is that we're really resistant to growing. And it's only by growing that you actually can generate the revenues to pay for a city that constantly improves. And that lack of faith in growth is the function of the fact that people don't feel that the growth over the last 25 years was fair. And then we see that, and we've seen it magnified through COVID in terms of healthcare, in terms of criminal justice in the wake of George Floyd, et cetera. So we have to attack the problems, but innovation can help. And hopefully we can talk some more about that over the course of the half hour.
Daniel, since March, we've seen a significant shift to work from home at times, everybody. Do you think that we're meeting the technological demands of this work style? It's going to continue for a while. And if not, how can we close the gap?
Yeah, so I think, in the early months of the pandemic, everyone was focused on the 3 C's, connectivity, computing, and cameras. Can you actually see anyone? And getting those 3 things was really hard for a lot of people. Not everyone had a computer at home to work from. Not everyone had a webcam that they could use to have video conferences with. And so most of that early time was spent on, can we actually make this work just from a purely basic, can we get online? But as we move into kind of the longer term side of the pandemic, as we're really thinking about what this looks like for people's long-term careers, we need to focus on other C's. So the first one would be culture. It's much easier to work remotely now when everyone's remote. It used to be that one of the biggest challenges to working remotely is that if the boss was in the office, everyone wanted to come in because they wanted to be around that boss. They wanted to have the face time. But now we're seeing that cultural change where, the expectation is it's okay to work from home. It's okay to be remote. And there's also a recognition that people have lives at home too. And so, when parents are having to take care of their children and help them get online, there's a little bit more flexibility in the workplace that used to not be there. That's a very positive cultural change that we've seen here. The second C would be community. As we shift online, there's new questions about how this changes both the professional and personal relationships that we have. 2 spouses working from home creates new challenges that didn't exist in the past. But also, how we connect with other people we work with. Do we have the means to build those relationships that you get around the coffee coolers and, meeting people in person, having lunch with your colleagues. And so there's new tools to analyze that. And some of that's actually technological tools where now, because all the communication is happening online, you're seeing new tools being developed that can tell you, what does the employee sentiment in this organization look like? Are people generally happy? Are people being positive on their Slack channels and email communications? So I think there's lots of really interesting innovation we're going to see in that space. And the last is what could be called the commute issue, which is that people used to have a commute. And while most people never liked their commute, that commute was an opportunity to be alone, to have some time to reflect, maybe listen to a podcast, do some learning. It was a time to go outside, get some sunshine, go for a walk. And now there's a question of, are we still, helping our own mental health and our, employee wellness by having this, dedicated time to be away from the home, to be away from work, and just have some time to yourself. And so I think as we kind of move into this later stages of the pandemic, the real question is, how can we not only get everything in place that we need to actually be able to work, but also make it sustainable long-term and function well for everyone?
Let me tell you, I have 3 kids under 4, I definitely miss being alone. That would have been.
That's right.
Look, I did have I was a little bit hopeful early on. You mentioned the culture shift with everybody working from home and how that changes. There was a piece of me that was hopeful that there would be a culture shift in working that would make some work culturally and just physically more possible, both for maybe mothers who needed to fit in time or fathers, parents needed to fit in time around childcare who have maybe dropped out of the workforce, or even people with disabilities, that it would normalize people working from home in a different way. And I actually think that we're seeing a little bit of the opposite, that we're seeing a new report came out this week, I think somewhere around 800,000 Women so far have dropped out of the workforce, mostly for childcare responsibilities, for the lack of being able to balance it. And so, Commissioner, I want to turn to you. So as we normalize, it's not just work, it's virtual everything, it's telehealth, it's gatherings. How do we make sure that as we do this, that as we move to virtual everything, that we do it in a more inclusive way so that as cities are growing, no one's left behind?
Such a good question. I mean, it's hard to remember, but it was March, months and months ago. As a nation, we were sent home and told to go to school online, go to work online, seek out our healthcare online, and so much more. But in the process of moving from this physical analog world to a wholly digital one, we exposed a pretty hard truth, which is that our digital divide is very real and very big. And the official data at my agency and in Washington, frankly, don't capture the scope of it. I think our official numbers suggest that only 18 million people don't have access to broadband. I think that number wildly underestimates the size of our digital divide. And here's why. We have deployment challenges in rural communities where we don't have the infrastructure, but we also have adoption challenges in many of our cities where 3 to 4 times as many people simply don't have reliable, affordable online access at home. And that has huge consequences for a nation that's been asked to go to work and go to school online. And I really think it comes down to this. We have got to remedy the digital divide, just like we expect to have 100% of our households with clean water, 100% with electricity. We need 100% with access to broadband. And we need 100% to be our national policy, because that's the pathway to the kind of inclusion you're talking about.
What does that mean to have it as a national policy?
Well, I think there's some power in just stating that out loud, because when you state it out loud, you put pressure on every federal actor, state actor, and local actor to work together to identify where there are gaps in infrastructure and where there are real challenges with affordability. And then we've got to figure out how to boost our existing programs to cover those gaps. I really believe you have to state these things out loud in Washington to get everyone rowing in the same direction. And we give a lot of, talk and chatter out the side about the importance of the digital divide, but we've got to realize this is the infrastructure that is the foundation for all of civic and commercial life. We've got to make sure everybody has a fair shot at getting access.
I couldn't agree with that more. We have to make it a national goal. Within 10 years, every single person in this country has access to reliable and affordable broadband service. We've done this before.
Right.
We did it with electrification. We did it with the telephone. There's all sorts of subsidies that were given to that back then, AT&T, and mandates in order to make everybody have access. We can do this, and we absolutely have to. It is I think, a matter of national priority. And by the way, it's not easy. We have to recognize that, you talk about lack of broadband access in New York City, it's horrible. In the Bronx, one of the things that Sidewalk Labs did was with the city do these Wi-Fi kiosks. 30% of the people in the Bronx actually got broadband access through one of like 150 kiosks. That's horrible. People literally sitting out on the streets to get broadband access because they couldn't afford it or it wasn't available. That's foundational for not just fairness, but for our recovery as well.
I totally agree.
Daniel, I want to bring you into this because you've written about, as new technology comes onto the market, you've written about the hesitation of American cities to embrace it. For instance, the ban on e-scooters. So what should government be doing to adapt versus block innovation?
I think the problem with new technologies is that it's very easy to imagine how things might go wrong. And it actually takes sometimes more creativity to figure out how it might go right. I mean, if you think about, even something like flying, if that were introduced today, of course, people would be saying, why would you want to put me in a small metal tube with combustible liquid flying through the air at 500 miles per hour? That's insane. Everything, we can never trust that this technology would work. But of course, we do, and there's plenty of technologies that have a lot of concerns, and you go through and mitigate that. And we see this with digital technologies a lot, where there's concerns about privacy, safety, or a whole host of unintended consequences. So, but what we do know is that generally innovation is good for society. It leads to economic and social progress. So the role of government should be to act as guardrails, not a roadblock. It should be to really see how we can move forward with new technologies in ways that protect people, that and enable everyone to share in the benefits. And so sometimes I think government approaches this only through a regulatory lens, which can be useful. Sometimes we need regulation to be those guardrails, to say this is how we can be sure that technology protects people. But another way the government can really be a leader in this space is by being an early adopter, by saying, we're going to help drive progress by really guiding the market in the right direction, and by bringing vendors to the table and telling them this is what we want and this is what we're demanding, and really steer the ship in that way. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity as we move forward coming out of the pandemic, especially with any kind of recovery bills that might come out of this, to start applying technology in ways that can directly address the challenges that people face and get around the new concerns that often arise with new technology. So if we're going to be deploying more Wi-Fi hotspots, great, let's do it, and let's make sure we're protecting people's privacy when we're doing that. If we're increasing broadband access, great, let's do it and make sure everyone has access to e-learning and health IT, and they're actually getting the benefits of the connectivity, not just the connectivity itself.
And Commissioner, you're at a regulatory organization. I mean, how do we have a perfect person right here to be asking about this? Where are examples do you think that we could really see a productive relationship moving forward to be able to move into these big ideas between government and perhaps something like Sidewalk Labs, like Dan brought up, as a private organization?
Well, it's just apparent to me that we've got problems to solve and resources that are constrained and communities that haven't really figured out the full advantages of the digital age. So how do we create an environment where we're all inclined to experiment a little more? I think the existing administration has not exactly fostered that environment at my agency, and I'll give you an example. When it comes to the deployment of communications infrastructure, most of our decisions have been about taking away authority from local officials. And I understand that's in part because they want to see the deployment of this infrastructure faster, but it's created enough friction that I think in the process, we're not actually expediting this infrastructure, and we're not speeding the way for new experiments. So I think we've got to reorganize our thinking about this so that the federal government becomes partners with local officials, so that we can figure out what creative things they can do with spectrum policy and deployment to increase the likelihood. For instance, we could use sensors on cars and on roadway infrastructure to reduce the commute times and do things that are really productive and increase the quality of life. I think we have to, though, rebuild this idea that we can do this as partners, because in recent years, I think we've increased the friction between federal authorities and local officials when it comes to these kind of initiatives.
I think there are two things that are required to make technology get integrated into the basically physical environment. One is leadership. We talked about that in the context of, for example, a national broadband strategy. But, government is about leadership at the end of the day. And what you need is leaders who are willing to step up and take some risk. And that is often in very short supply in government at all levels of government. I think I was part of a administration in New York that really was prepared to do new things and try new things, even if sometimes we were going to get it wrong. I'm not saying everybody would agree with everything we did. For sure, they weren't in agreement, but you've got to be able to take risks. The second thing, which is more subtle, and I think maybe more powerful, there exists what I would call an urbanist technologist divide. The urbanists are the people who plan cities, run cities, build cities, and the technologists are the ones who develop the technologies that hopefully will get integrated into our urban environments. Those two types of people don't speak the same language. And what we have to do is find ways of bridging that gap. That's what we try and do, for example, at Sidewalk Labs, is bring together right at the very core urbanists and technologists. And I can tell you, even within a company, it's hard to get people to ultimately learn to speak that same language. We cannot afford to ignore the difficulty of ensuring that we actually are speaking the same language.
Well, Dan, I'd like to follow up with you on that point, on a place that cities that, we call it an evolution, a disruption that was happening already, but with the rise of the gig economy, people, I think particularly in cities, kind of got used to being able to get things on demand. We saw it even more once the kind of lockdown went into place in March with COVID, but it really is disrupting the way that people are thinking about work, are getting work. Everything from the way that our traffic flow is running, the way that our subways are being funded. So what do you think is the right balance there for growing, acknowledging that we do have a rise in the gig economy?
Well, obviously we have a rise, and we've seen impacts of that rising gig economy before the pandemic. What we've seen is the acceleration of trends that were, I think, apparent beforehand. So for example, retail. So think about e-commerce. E-commerce in a way is devastating our retail environment, which in an urban context means the street life deteriorates. And so we have to find new ways of reviving that retail environment. Some of them might be financial incentives, but at the end of the day, what we have to do is use tools that are now available to rethink that urban environment. What limits people's willingness to try and set up new retail stores? Part of it is having to enter into long-term leases. And so part of the reason developers or owners of property don't want to enter into short-term leases is because they don't want to have to pay for renovation costs if things don't work out. So how do we use the technology that's available to make it possible to make, for example, buildings easier to renovate? Well, there's a new technology called digital electricity, where electricity is delivered over Ethernet cables, which is safer than regular electricity, which means you don't have to put wires in the walls. If you do that, then you can develop wall systems that are easier to actually move. So this is just one simple example of understanding the problem that exists, thinking about the technologies that are available out there, and then thinking about how we're actually going to deploy them into the real world. For every problem we have, there are answers, but we have to be honest about what the problems are. We have to recognize that things aren't going to go back to the way they were, but it's that situational analysis that is the foundation ultimately for the solution.
Daniel, something that we've raised already, but I think not spent enough time on, is the balance with privacy. You brought this up, but look, we've seen everything from major corporations to local governments to fall victim to ransom attacks, and that doesn't even include what we're concerned about just from a daily basis of government having all this information about private citizens through technology. So what are the biggest roadblocks to getting networks secured, and how nervous should the average person be about adopting technology?
Yeah, well, as Dan mentioned, we have to get the urbanists and the technologists in the room. We also need to get the security specialists in the room because too often IT security is just taking a back seat in so many different projects. And sometimes it makes sense, right? If you're doing a pilot project, you want to see if the application even works before you start dealing with all those problems. But we know that technology is going to be a key part of cities going forward. And we know we need to get the security part right, especially when everything is digital and people are relying on these services. The fact is we have seen cities be a prime target for ransomware attacks over the last few years, in part because, for two reasons. One, these are mission critical services that cities have to get up and they know they have to be responsive to citizens. And two, they're willing to pay when there's a ransomware attack. And so, those make them ripe targets for attackers to go after. So we need to start investing more in cybersecurity in this space. That means, dedicated teams in government that can address known threats. It means providing more funding to address these threats that we've identified. It also means updating a lot of these outdated systems. Some of the systems can be 20, 30 years old. And you can't just patch these. These are systems that have to be rebuilt. Sometimes you don't have programmers around who even write in these languages anymore. So that's a big part of it. But I think part of the other half of this policy debate is, we can't just focus on privacy, because for some communities and some people, the problem isn't that too much data is being collected about them, but that too little data is being collected about them. So for a lot of people, the problem is that they are invisible in data sets, and these are going to be key data sets that we're going to be using to make decisions about where we make investments in communities, what types of resources go where we deploy city aid. And so we know there's a digital divide, but there's also a data divide, and that needs to be part of the conversation. We need to focus on closing that data divide, eliminating data poverty, and really addressing people's needs, because as everything becomes digital, if you're invisible in the data, you're going to be invisible in city services as well.
Okay, this is really personal, but should I download the COVID New York app? I wasn't sure.
I did.
I'd go for it.
You did? Okay, this is a good panel of experts.
Yeah, I mean, personal, as you say, but look, we're in this together, and it is an app that actually can help us together kind of reduce the spread of COVID, track it more effectively. I think everybody should be downloading it.
Well, that's a great segue into a question that I'd like to ask all of the panelists. So Commissioner, I'll start with you. If you had the power to do anything, what is one thing that you would change in cities with the use of technology?
I would solve what I call the homework gap. It is apparent that every child needs internet access to succeed in school today. By the way, that was true before this pandemic, where the data showed that 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires internet access, but only 1 in 3 households, but 1 in 3 households has no broadband. So there were millions and millions of kids living in households without internet access before this crisis. And they fell into this homework gap. And now that homework gap is bigger than ever, because the best estimates are that we have 17 million students across this country, many of them in cities, who are locked out of the virtual classroom. There's no remote learning. And it feels to me that in the United States of America, every child should have internet access so they can go to school and have a fair shot at their education. So from wireless hotspots to more infrastructure to experiments with unlicensed spectrum and Wi-Fi, we need to do more. I think no child should be left offline.
My understanding now is that the Brooklyn Public Library is providing hotspots for many children to be learning on. That's not a permanent solution.
Yeah, the New York libraries have actually done some of the earliest experiments with this, loaning out hotspots, which is terrific. Every school should be able to do that. Just like a school will loan you a math textbook or a grammar book for the semester, we should be able to loan those kind of things out of our school libraries. I mean, there are solutions that are available to us, and they're not audacious. We just have to commit as a nation to saying that the homework gap is something we can solve, and that we can make sure every child can get to virtual class.
So Daniel, I'll ask you the same question. If you could do anything, what is one thing that you would change in cities with the use of technology?
Yeah, well, I'll definitely stick with the education theme. And in addition to connectivity, I think we really need to be looking at using artificial intelligence as this kind of next generation of how we provide personalized, accessible, user-centric design for online learning and offline learning as well. I think there are so many instances right now where, the way we do education, we're even as we're moving to the online world, we're still doing this one-to-many, the typical classroom lecture where there's a teacher talking to 30 students. And that works for some educating, but we need a lot more personalized education where people are learning at different levels. Some kids get bored because the material is too easy for them. Some kids are left behind because it's moving too fast. What you really want is a personalized education that's based on the feedback that you're providing. It's learning about how you learn and providing you information in different types of contexts. And this needs to be much more scalable than it is right now. It's sad to me that we see so many different school districts and sometimes individual schools trying to innovate themselves instead of actually taking a national or at least statewide approach to many of these issues. And with AI and many of these digital technologies, we can achieve scale very quickly if we focus on doing it right.
But to your point about the balance of trying to start small before you scale something up, what should be the balance between trying to start in individual schools and school districts to start as innovation labs versus adopting a national policy?
Well, I think there's areas where, there's still, for better or worse, there's Common Core. So we know what children should be learning, and we can innovate around that. I think the way you'd want to approach this is actually a modular approach. So you can have competing modules for how do you learn certain types of information, and then different school districts can plug it in, and you can do evidence-based research about what's actually most effective. And for different types of learners, that will be different types of modules. And that's how you scale it up. And that's how you still have individual innovation. But right now, we're trying to have every school district innovate on the actual platform. And that's the part that doesn't make sense. We can have a universal platform and then innovate around how you actually do the best teaching, which is where we have more distributed skills.
So Dan, I feel like you're going to have a lot of ideas here. But what is one thing that we could change in cities with the use of technology?
Well, since both the commissioner and Daniel mentioned education, I won't. I think the biggest issue we face in cities, particularly in our desire to have inclusive and equitable cities, is really the affordability question. And the single biggest component of the lack of affordability is housing. Our housing in many cities just way too expensive. And in part, that is because there's been virtually no innovation whatsoever in the construction industry over literally almost the last 100 years. I mean, in fact, if you look at productivity in construction compared to the economy in general, it is sad, really sad. So there's all new approaches, we think, to reducing construction costs significantly, and therefore making housing in particular more affordable. One example that we're working on at Sidewalk Labs is factory automated mass timber buildings, which we think we can dramatically lower the cost. This is an old material, wood, that's redone in a different way that can be processed in all sorts of new ways using robotics and other things. That's the kind of thing that we need to truly move the needle on the affordability question. And until we can really have more diverse, inclusive communities, our cities are not really going to recover.
Thank you all very much for helping us understand how to make cities smarter. I feel like I'm a little smarter in how to think about my city. So really appreciate the conversation here and hope everyone sticks around for the rest of the day to understand more from our experts about the future of cities.
I think I'll start off this morning. Our topic for this morning is making hospitals work better. And I'd love to start off the conversation. We're going to have 3 questions this morning with each of the panelists speaking on these 3 questions. The first question will be, how is the pandemic reshaping patient care within the hospital and the community at large? Naomi, I was hoping you could start out with this question.
Sure. It's from the perspective of a health system, caring for patients who have COVID. I think it's varied through the different phases of the pandemic. Obviously, initially, when the caseloads were going up in the first couple of geographies back in March and April, it was repurposing all of healthcare to take care of one disease. But now, as we've come out kind of on the other side of that, I think there are some lasting impacts to how it's shaping patient care. Certainly within the facility, the idea of kind of having flex capacity is something we previously did not really plan for. I mean, we had emergency preparedness, but being able to surge up capacity rapidly, that's different. Thinking about cohorting patients, certainly different. And then I think especially thinking about the fact that there are many, especially with a disease like COVID, where there's a lot of asymptomatic spread. There's a lot of transmission during the incubation period. The idea that any patient who's there for something else may also be COVID positive, and so social distancing, in the waiting rooms, temperature checks before you come in. It's a completely different set of operations. I think often people forget that healthcare delivery is an operations business, and so the same way that if you're running a manufacturing facility, you have to rework every aspect of your operational workflow to accommodate the fact that there may be 1%, 2%, 3% of the population who are carrying a communicable disease here that has impact on the community at large. We have to do the same thing in healthcare. as well.
Excellent, thank you. Lionel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting impacts that we're seeing is the notion of having caregivers in hospitals, and the impact that we're learning that actually has on the operations of the hospitals. As you're seeing these hospitals actually evolve and not have families coming for patients, it's streamlined the process of actually delivering care. And I think that that's going to become an important conversation as we move forward in looking at hospitals about how are these hospitals actually working. We know that we're dealing with anxiety of patients. We're also dealing with anxiety of those people who bring them. Have we really designed hospitals to allow for that to be the most streamlined process that we can? And if it changes, how will it change this operation system that we're discussing right now, which is delivering healthcare?
Excellent. James. You're on mute, James. You could.
Sorry about that. I had myself muted by Lionel and Nia were talking. So from our perspective, the problem's got two parts. It's kind of a population health problem, and then it's a system design problem, right? And so our population health models, I think, have to become more attuned to what's going on in their communities. And so our sort of means of detection can become more sophisticated, but also be founded on an understanding of what the status in the communities are. So, traditionally, these models would take into consideration, the demographics, age distribution, disease incident rates in those different age cohorts, and how services can be distributed within the communities to address these issues. I think other factors that need to now play into this have to do with social determinants of health and status. And frankly, I think you're going to see the emergence of new providers into healthcare to specifically address this situation, because the financial incentives historically have not supported large portions of the population that really need regular engagement with healthcare providers. I think the second part of this, what we've learned in the hospitals themselves, is that it's devastating to the provider and to the community to basically shut down the entire system to care for a single disease. Everything else came to a grinding halt. And the pandemic really exposed these weaknesses to us. And so we now need to think about ways that we can maintain sort of normal operations in the provision of care while we're addressing these major events like pandemic or mass casualty or whatever it may be. All of that needs to factor into our planning, and it places a real premium on flexibility. So we're looking at sort of multi-track systems within the hospital that could function for one set of patients under normal circumstances, but be converted, say in a pandemic, to care for those people affected by the pandemic and keep them on a separate track while still maintaining the rest of hospital operations. Now that, you have to think about that continuum all the way through the hospital. I mean, COVID exposed weaknesses in the critical care chain, in our emergency departments, in our ICU beds, and variable acuity beds and so on. But I think from a planning and design perspective, we really have to look at it systematically.
Kirsten, just one thing I'd add to that, to James's point. I think that point on flexibility is absolutely paramount. I'm just thinking about some of the decisions we're making, on the heels of this, of, how to use space flexibly, because we don't necessarily, healthcare isn't financed in a way to necessarily support a bunch of standby capacity. And so we're looking at things down, in the weeds, and I'd shared with Kirsten earlier this week, we had a proposal come in from one of our hospitals around, they were doing a renovation of an OB floor, for labor and delivery. And there's a question about, okay, for these 14 rooms, should we spend a little bit of extra money to make them able to be converted to negative pressure rooms? Which the idea of having, negative, for those who don't know in the audience, negative pressure rooms help contain the spread of infectious disease. The idea of having negative pressure rooms in a labor and delivery unit is nonsensical. But, in a period where we had 2,300 COVID positive inpatients in our hospital just 6 months ago, everybody's thinking, okay, you know, a negative pressure room is a premium commodity if I can create that. And so it's really causing us to think differently about that flex capacity, and you know, in a way that we've really never had to before.
Yeah, I guess we're all super interested in this topic because I can see everyone's heads nodding about it. You know, I was talking earlier this week about it, and you know, for me, I actually think it's an expansive, massive moment in time question about the country and how we manage something that could kill 200,000 people, right? And the impact of that as a sort of a visual into our national defense and how we treat these things and not burden the hospitals. Right, the hospitals can't sustain that kind of impact, and this might just be the tip of an iceberg. There could be something a lot worse. So, is there a way that we start to reimagine how we spend defense budgeting on something like a pandemic across the country, like an Eisenhower system, and say this is what we need to do, and we need to be prepared, and we need to build an army of citizens who have a role and understand what their role is in the event that something like that comes along, and that's big thinking, and you know, I think that it'll be really interesting to see if we have the courage to get there. But I really think that any scenario, it's great. By the way, I think it's amazing. We should do that with the OB rooms, but the scale of what we're talking about, you could see how these things just bang into each other, and you're like, that's like putting a Band-Aid on a massive problem. And I think we have to do that, but we also have to figure this thing out. And it could be really fundamentally impactful on the health of our cities and the health of all the people in cities, because you can create a whole community center that does something when it's not a pandemic and is designed to take that on in the event that something happens. And it might even pull some of the things out of hospitals that really don't need to be there.
Right. I think one of the things that it really is exposed, just to pick up on your point, Lionel, is that human health is an urban planning problem as much as it is anything else. One of the things that I find interesting is that a lot of our academic medical center clients were in the process of rethinking their own roles in their communities when the pandemic hit. So beyond the provision of care, dealing with social determinants, trying to figure out how to deliver let's call it low acuity care on a cost-effective basis, so there's engagement with the entire community. And we've seen academic centers around the country looking at developing housing where there are housing shortages or a lack of affordable housing, developing healthy alternatives for food and for everyday well-being, you know, in the course of their own sort of development. And this is a real sea change in the way of thinking of these institutions whose mission historically has been care, teaching, and research, right? Care, teaching, and research is what they did. That was the focus. How to integrate those things and bring them together was a big part of the conversation. But I think what they've realized is that the social housing stress, housing insecurity, food deserts, and so on have a huge impact on how the health system is used. And for a lot of healthcare providers, you know, the emergency department was the primary care site for big chunks of their communities. And it's really unnecessary for about 30 or 40% of the people who show up in our emergency departments to actually be in our emergency departments. And only 20 to 25% of those are even admitted to the hospital. So the reason why we need to rethink our population health models is so that we can inform the redistribution of care and services in our communities. But along with that comes the creation of awareness in those communities, that people can go to these places that are in their neighborhoods and know that they're safe, know that the services there are comprehensive, and if they need higher levels of care, they're available to them within the system. Your only alternative is not the emergency department. And I think, so that there's a communication plan, I think, that goes along with this rethinking of how we distribute services. Yeah,
excellent. Well, I think that tags in with the next question here is, how has the pandemic and the experience and expectation changed for the patient, family, and the caregiver? And I'm going to add also, we've talked about flexibility a lot the first couple minutes. how can technology be leveraged during this transformation and the experience as part of that? If you could speak with that. Niam, do you want to go ahead and start with that?
Yeah, I think it's the pandemic probably accelerated a bunch of things we already knew around this. And so, patients, family members, they value flexibility. And our strategy around this has been to give people kind of an omni-channel experience, right? They can interact with us however they want to. If they want to be in person, they can be in person. If it's virtual, telemedicine, all of that. It has been shocking to me. I mean, we had telemedicine rolled out across our entire system, almost all of our physicians, well before the pandemic. In February, right before COVID kind of hit New York, we did 0.5% of our ambulatory visits via telemedicine. In March and April, we did about 55% of them via telemedicine. And the total volume hadn't dropped, tremendously. It dropped a little bit. We were doing more per day during March and April telemedicine visits than we did per year in 2019. All the technology was there. All the reimbursement was the same, right? And so people often say, oh, the technology's hard. It's not, it's easy. People say the reimbursement's hard. The reimbursement's hard, but it's possible, right? Even before the pandemic. The funny thing was the literally thousands of physicians that we had who said, my patients won't want telehealth, who were then, cranking out 15 telehealth visits a day, right? Or the hundreds of thousands of patients who actually told us, who voted with their feet. They were like, yeah, I know you have this telehealth thing, but I like coming in person. Well, when you can't come in person, you use it. And guess what? They liked it, right? They liked it, and they're using it more. And we redeployed a bunch of our assets towards other digital engagement methodologies. We launched a text-to-chat function that people loved. There's I think the demand around digital and technology, people are getting it now. And they use it in every other aspect of their life. I mean, when you book a plane ticket, you don't call up to do that anymore. When was the last time you called a travel agent? Like, I book a flight every time I book it on the app in 30 seconds, right? And we're all used to that. And healthcare was behind, and it was behind for a whole bunch of reasons that, could probably take 3 hours for us to all opine on here. But the pandemic showed us that we could accelerate there. Just like, as James was saying, it showed us that we could accelerate on population health, that we could get out into the community more rapidly. And so, I think that's interesting, certainly there. The one thing I would just throw out, though, that it also reveals, and especially because James talked about the social determinants of health here, health equity is really important. And there's been a lot of work in the traditional healthcare delivery system to enhance equity. When we start thinking about leveraging digital more aggressively, the point of the digital divide becomes really in your face, right? And so it's easy to say, sure, during the stay-at-home order, we have telemedicine. What if you don't have a reliable broadband? What if you have a pay-as-you-go mobile data plan and you can't use it? And we, our largest hospital sits right at the intersection of East Harlem and the Upper East Side. There are no two adjacent zip codes besides 10128 and 1029, right where the 92Y is located. No two adjacent zip codes in the country with a higher median income disparity. And we serve those two communities. And it is noticeable. And finding that we actually it just means we need to invest differently and more, and in a different way through partnerships with organizations like Silicon Harlem to identify broadband, dead spots and invest there to ensure that as patient and family expectations change, we're able to meet all of our patients there, not just some of them. And so that's work ahead, and it's work worth doing, and it'll be hard work, and we'll all do it. But it's, kind of the pandemic shined a light on the fact that, digital is not necessarily the great equalizer. It can actually, be a divider also. And so we just need to be cognizant of that.
Right. No, it's a really important point, right? I mean, what's it? Sophocles said that nothing vast comes to mortals without a curse. You need to understand, right, both what the upside and how that can be leveraged on behalf of everybody, and what the downside is and how that can be addressed in the communities, what kind of role a provider can play in addressing what some of those disparities might be. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if we see some of the providers that we've been talking about who have been thinking about housing insecurity and food deserts and other social determinants, that broadband becomes a part of the social determinant conversation, and there's an investment there in making sure that there's robust engagement with everybody in the community. And it's going to be critically important going forward because the hospitals themselves are going to be increasingly digital. And this whole notion of the digital hospital has been kicking around for a little while. And I think the pandemic has only accelerated that kind of development. The only other thing I would add is that an important aspect of this is kind of restoring trust in the system. The healthcare providers have to make the people that they serve in their communities aware that they've taken steps to address their safety when they have to come to the hospital. There's a lot we can push out into our communities. There's a lot we can do digitally, but if you need an MRI or if you need a surgical procedure or you need to stay overnight, you need to come to the hospital. And so restoring trust in the system and creating awareness that as healthcare providers and people who are concerned with human health generally have done everything possible to address their safety when there's physical engagement, not just digital engagement, but physical engagement with the system is also going to be an important aspect of this.
It's interesting talking about the digital hospital. We just finished the hospital for Sloan Kettering, and the RTLS technology that is implemented in the hospital. We really looked at that as an opportunity of empowerment, right? As an opportunity to create an experience for patients that they may not otherwise get. So by having that technology on the patients, which is basically an RFID badge, so you know where everybody is, we untether people to a clinic door, right? Because everyone goes to a hospital. We start cutting through all the steps, all the procedural steps, and reinventing that interaction that you have. And in a hospital where you're going several times a week for potentially years for long stays, if you're doing chemo or infusion or radiation treatment, and your moods can change as you're going through there, having technology as part of the experience, aside from just the kind of the efficiency that it potentially allows. What we looked at was how can we make this hospital do more for the patients so that they can be more empowered to be in a positive space so that they have a better chance of having a positive experience in the hospital. And so some of the things that technology are starting to show us that we could do is, number one, get rid of waiting rooms, right? Which is a necessary evil because of how it all works. But if you detethered me from a clinic door, now I can start to say, well, what should I do with all these waiting rooms, which are stacked 17 floors tall, and actually program them to be positive engagements for people so that they're doing something, right? And their mental connection to going to the hospital is about actually inspiring them into something positive, learning a language, writing a book, using Photoshop, going to a class, learning macrobiotic cooking, whatever that programming can be. And so I see how that's like we're seeing the seed of that happening, giving people choice, right? And I think that's what digital at its best can do, both in the hospital and outside of it. It's like give people choice, give people control, right? And allow them to sort of like not have to be victimized because they're sick, right? You're sick, we can get through this, and it could be a positive experience on so many levels and inspire other people as they're coming through it. So I think that the digital question is really important. I think that you guys are 100% right. This is a massive accelerator of the telehealth. Like, let's just push through this and get to that level. And then let's see what that does. What does it do by taking all that traffic out of the hospitals? What now can we do in there? And what does it do for people to sort of free them up to do other things? So it's a good time right now for hospitals to invest into new ideas, into new technologies, I think.
It actually is. I agree with you. Yeah, completely.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to round out this last question. How do we think the pandemic is reshaping the physical space? And is that physical space now going to be within the hospitals and clinics? Do we see it expanding within the communities? How do we see that piece moving forward? Lionel, do you want to kick us off for that one?
I mean, I think we don't know. I think it's like how courageous do we want to be? How big of a sort of revolution or evolution do we want to have? When the dust settles, I think I think a lot of the hospital organizations are going to say, why is this falling on us? This is a bigger problem than we can handle, and we need everyone to sort of roll up their sleeves and figure it out. And to the point about, urban planning and understanding what our cities look like, I think that's absolutely the truth. And it's very hard for me to posit right now where that goes. And the President of the United States just got COVID-19, and what impact that has on the conversation as a broad conversation about how serious something like this actually is. So, I think that I hope that conversation becomes a movement, a movement for change, that we really see the idea of how our cities work, our responsibility as individuals for other people in our communities not to get sick and take that seriously, and then build healthy cities. And I think it's, you and I were talking about the biggest technology to get us through this is washing your hands and wearing a mask, right? So the bar's low. We can, if we can get that solved, then we're
rocket science.
It's not huge technology. We don't need Elon Musk for that part of it. So, I think it could be a really, really amazing conversation for where we go forward.
Excellent. James, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the only thing I'd add, and that's spot on, and I'd be interested actually in Lionel and James's perspectives on this. They're more experts on this than I am, but I do, and maybe I'm a little bit colored by being in New York City for this. There is a question about where the physical space is needed from kind of an urban planning and geographic standpoint, and so. I just look at some of our hospitals that are further away from the core of the city have recovered more quickly from kind of a patient flow standpoint than the ones in the heart of the city. And there was historically, and we were already moving away from this in healthcare, but historically there was a come to the center for the high acuity care, right? And that's it's just kind of how, especially on the East Coast and on the West Coast, how cities worked as it related to healthcare. The country has 2.3 hospital beds per 1,000 people. New York City has 2.8. Manhattan has 6. Like that, why, right? And it's like Manhattan has 6 beds per 1,000 people because it's the third most populous borough, not the most populous borough. And people from Brooklyn and Queens utilize in Manhattan, and people from Long Island utilize in Manhattan. And so that trend was already changing, right? There are great quality institutions further out the side of the city, and more ambulatory surgery centers and more community practices. But there's a question of as people but I live and work in Manhattan. As I look at and I went to work throughout the entire pandemic. In March and April, streets were empty. I mean, you've never seen a Manhattan with less traffic than this. And now the traffic's back, but the streets are still largely empty. People, I talk to people in other industries, they work from home 2-3 days a week, even if they are in the office a couple of days. They're moving, they're shrinking their, the space that they're taking overall. Well, this idea of, do I want a doctor close to home or a doctor close to work? That discussion starts changing if home is work, right? Or if home is work at least half the time. Even in a post-vaccine, many years post-pandemic world, that discussion changes. Well, then if my doctor is close to home, maybe the other thing should be close to home. Maybe I need the specialist close to home. Maybe I want to get the surgery close to home. And, that was always a discussion. But when you take work out of the picture as a different location, you might be thinking about utilization patterns differently. And, these are things that hospitals need to be thinking about 10, 20, 30 years in advance. I mean, you don't go just build a new hospital every other week because you found a better street corner to put it on. And so I think there's something there that, is yet to be seen. As Lionel said, we don't know yet, but I'd really be interested, you guys are more expert on this than I am. I'd be interested in your thoughts on what's happening to the urban center and what are the implications for healthcare?
Yeah, James, you round us out for the last 3 minutes here. That would be a great.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for teeing me up here, Naim, because you make a great point about the distribution of services. The borough of Brooklyn has over 2.5 million people in it and 1 academic medical center. The city of Philadelphia has about 1.8 million people and has 5 academic medical medical centers. So it's interesting how the historical economic forces have aggregated health services in a way that doesn't necessarily respond directly to the urban and communal needs for those services, right? It's not, distribution of those services historically has not been purely based on community need, right? As it probably should be. The other thing I would add is that the provision of healthcare has also been largely a risk-averse industry. I've had more than one CEO or COO of a health system tell me that they're happy to be second with a new technology or a new operational model. You know, there are very few, there's like half a dozen in the US who want to be first, who are really looking for that innovation, but they're a small slice of the industry. Most of the industry is looking to those leaders as kind of the test cases for new ideas, new technologies, new service distributions, and so on. So I think using population health models that are informed in the ways that we've been discussing really can go a long way to solving some of these problems relative to how services are distributed and the kinds of spaces we need to do that, because we are at the same time deconstructing the hospital. There's a lot that's being done at the hospital that really doesn't need to be there. I think the only one more thing I'd like to add is we were looking at doing things to improve the patient experience before COVID hit. And you know, some of those things included the elimination of waiting rooms, making the medical staff workspace immediately adjacent to the exam and consultation and procedure spaces, so that we were both making better use of medical staff time, while at the same time making the access and use, wayfinding, amenities, and so on easier and better for patients and their families who were coming to the medical centers, right? So we were, you know, we've done half a dozen projects where there's really no waiting space at all, and we've turned that space over for clinical treatment space or for medical staff workspace or for amenity spaces for patients and their families. And I think that kind of rethinking has programmatic implications for how we develop our service models when we're contemplating new models for care. And what I'm hoping is that those risk-averse folks, and there are lots of them in our industry, will see this opportunity. They will see that the pandemic, in exposing the weaknesses, provides an opportunity for innovation, and that it's actually, they see that it's actually a greater risk to not innovate under these circumstances than it is to sit back and wait and see what somebody else does. There's a certain clarity that comes with this kind of global issue, right? That can focus people's attention on what needs to be done and the ways that they can do it.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. This concludes our panel discussion, and look forward to talking further about it outside the realms of the summit. So thank you very much. And that concludes our panel.
Thanks very much, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Hi, good morning. It's wonderful to be here, wherever here is, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, New York, and to think with you guys a little bit about what lessons the city's history holds for where we are now and how we're going to go forward. You know, we're at one of those apocalyptic moments. Like everything's ending. The city's going to die. And the city's had so many of those moments in its past, as every city has, but New York seems to have had an incredible lineup of them. I'm actually sitting in the same building by coincidence that I moved to in 1975 to go to college here. And you know, anybody with a little bit of a memory of the city's past will remember that 1975 was the year the famous Daily News headline, "Ford to City Drop Dead." the city was going totally down the drain. It was completely bankrupt. Federal government, Gerald Ford refused to help pay for getting it out of the drink. And so it looked like at that point, at the end of 75, early 76, that it was all over. Of course, there were still people, idiots like me, flooding into the city, went like, wow, this is the greatest place in the world. And I came here and, surprise, surprise, it didn't drop dead. It was going through massive problems, but it managed to hold itself together, as did cities everywhere. And I would say that just in my lifetime since I've been here, the number of kind of near extinction events, starting from drop dead in 75, have been so many. I mean, just the ones that are kind of indisputable moments of apocalypse, after that, 9/11, we're going to be blown off the face of the earth. Everybody was going to leave. The corporate culture was going to have to leave. It was too unsafe to be here. The fiscal crisis of 2008 to 12, maybe that was kind of like, in comparison, only a kind of a mini apocalypse. But now, look where we are now. 20 years, really almost exactly after 9/11, there's this new kind of extinction event that seems to be going on. And of course, not for New York exclusively. So the question is, will we survive? Is it all over? Is it too dangerous to be here, as in just dangerous to be in cities everywhere? And, I would submit that the history of New York from the very beginning has been the history of a place that has constantly generated those moments and constantly generated the ways you might get out of them. And it really is buried deep into the history of the entire city, right at the very beginning. I mean, New York's a young city compared to Jerusalem or Athens, but it's really old as a modern city. And maybe arguably, as Ken Jackson, the historian, has put it, it's maybe the first modern city. And it was started in the early 17th century by, the Dutch, who were reaching out, as Europeans were, to establish what turned out to be the first permanent networks of global commerce and culture and interaction. And when they came here, famously, they did not start it like, Quaker Philadelphia would start, or, Puritan Boston or Catholic Baltimore. It started as a business colony, the Dutch West India Company. And that meant when it began to sort of like put down roots in the 1620s, there were no rules for inclusion or exclusion. You didn't have to show your kind of ideological passport to be here. And sure enough, within 20 years, because it was only committed to making a guilder, with no rules for keeping anybody out, within 20 years, there were 40 languages spoken in New York. I mean, by the 1640s. And so what you have is this circumstance in which the intense commercial dedication begat from the beginning intense diversity. And those two forces, commerce and diversity, or what by the mid-19th century someone would call capitalism and democracy, really kind of are knit into the core of the city and have to do with, I think, the reasons why it is both, in many respects, skidded to the very edge of apocalypse, and also found ways, ingeniously or otherwise, not only to prevent itself from going over the edge, but sort of adapting creatively into the circumstance and moving into the future. And it's in that respect that the city's history has been, in so many respects, from the early 17th century, the history of the future. And why it has always been a city of tomorrow. And I don't think in that respect it's like some special DNA here. It's like, it's partly random and partly geographical, and partly the good fortune of being founded when it was, and by it was, this kind of rapacious Dutch commercial culture. And then you sort of look what happened over the course of the centuries, that those factors, those features, commerce and diversity, kind of like chunks of uranium in a reactor, gave rise to a whole that was much more than the sum of the parts. It was always extremely generative, extremely creative, very, very open, very, very willing to discard the past, you know, and open to new peoples, you know, new ideas, new products, new ways to make a guilder or a buck, new forms. And these gave rise, of course, to new challenges. You get all these people from so many different places crowding in together. And originally the different people were African Americans and then Irish Americans, and then the African Americans, of course, both enslaved and free, you know, so that the differences begat enormous friction. How do you create an identity out of all these people in one place? And sure enough, you know, the problems that were generated, you know, by this kind of experimental cauldron of here comes everybody, were, you know, and always in a very dense circumstance. And we got to remember, we think of, you know, Manhattan, 8 million, I mean, New York City, 8 million plus today, in a crowded city, but it was crowded in 1630. Everything was crowded down at the bottom of Manhattan, there down by what's called the Bowling Green, with the wall built by African Americans, enslaved African Americans, where Wall Street now is, to, on the one hand, to be sure to keep out the English and Native Americans, but also to create this space, dynamic space of interaction, where people bumped into each other on the crowded streets of Dutch New Amsterdam. And therefore, they may have set out in the morning with one idea in their head, but they had 14 new ones by the time they stumbled home at the end of the day. So that kind of density creates interaction and exchange and friction, to be sure, but also generates new ideas and opens up possibilities which were not thought of, you know, at dawn's early light. And you see what happens over the course of the century. Again and again, you know, the city comes partly as a result of this to these near extinction events, you know, in the colonial period, you know, to be sure, in the 18th century, you know, the city burned down in 1776 when, you know, the population plummeted from its maximum of 25,000. Suddenly, like, you know, the American, quote, patriots fled and left about 5,000 people, and in came the British, and half the city burned down and didn't die. You know, it went on from there. You know, it, like, people poured in. It became the, you know, commercial and manufacturing, as well as cultural center of the country in the early 19th century, partly because of its dynamism. And, you know, when 1,800,000 Irish people flee, you know, through the port of New York, fleeing the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, and a vastly lesser number of Germans arrived to this, at that point, largely English culture. It's like, you know, it lights a fuse. How are we going to take care of these new people? We don't like them. You know, the nativist movement, very much like our nativist movement today, goes, you know, through the roof. And by the time the Civil War breaks out, New York is a powder keg. And sure enough, during the Civil War, it explodes, the draft riots. You know, the city almost burns down. I mean, the image of New Yorkers, black and white, kind of walking north up the train tracks to get the hell out of Manhattan, out of New York City, was heartbreaking and disorienting, and it felt like the end of the world. You know, it felt like the end of the world in a different way in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, when 144 women were burned to death, many of them by leaping, you know, to the ground from the completely unregulated Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It felt like the end of the world, as I said, you know, when the idea of what a city was changed dramatically in the 20th century. Suddenly, it was the anti-urban phase, and all urban planning, as all of you urban planners know well, was based on decongestion, decentralization, pouring people out of the city, replacing it with kind of paving it over with grass, you know, the tower and the park. And the urban idea, it was thought mistakenly, was over, not just the city itself, but it was in that context in the post-war period, you know, that there was this massive exodus. And every problems we face to this day, of income inequality, of savage racial injustice, you know, infrastructural problems that would make your, you know, head spin, economic problems as the base of the city, economic base evaporated until by, the 1970s, it was just a city that had been hollowed out, it seemed, and that New York and the idea of cities was gone. But it survived. And, it survives because of the very quality that brings it to the edge. All these people coming together. And a certain kind of thing, which is not like a native genius, it's a requirement. If you're going to have all these people and get the benefits of them, the labor benefits, the commercial benefits, the sort of the industrial economic benefits, you've got to create a world in which they can live together somehow. And I would say, as my colleague James Sanders and I, have sort of figured out decades ago as we're trying to figure out what's the story of this place, it's the story of an experiment, which is how can all the peoples of the world live together in a single place, which is really just the story of the planet. So like a little advanced piece of the planet chipped off here in Manhattan and went like, okay, we're gonna have to figure it out. And here, it's not like if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. It's that, if we can't figure out a way in a place like New York, we're not gonna make it anywhere. So this is, that's the kind of special challenge. And it requires creativity, quote, I hate the phrase, thinking outside the box, thinking up new ideas, which is what any, confirmed capitalist wants to come up with, like a new mousetrap, a better mousetrap. And it requires creating an environment that's unusually legible and conducive to mobility. So sure enough, because you got all these people crammed in here, how the hell did they move around without kind of driving each other crazy? How do they get from A to B? So you have these remarkable things like the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, generated as the Industrial Revolution is beginning to boom here. What's the Commissioner's Plan? It is a map of the entire length of Manhattan when everybody was still basically crowded down below Canal Street. All those streets from 1st to 200th Street, the avenues east to west, projected on an essentially empty island. In other words, to make way for the anticipated mobility of an anticipated population, which sure enough, sort of surged in and surged up the island. The creation of parks, the creation of, in response to the draft riots of a metropolitan police force. Again and again and again, the ideas of how we could live together emerged from the very conditions that this surging, commercial, diverse cauldron had created. And therefore, I think that what we can feel is that as we moved across the 20th century and global problems abounded, and each one seemed, existential and life-threatening, is that again and again, the people, because they need to, have figured out how to generate a way of thinking of themselves as being all in it together, which is mean that an idea of the greater good, not just the how much can I make for me, coexist at the same time here. The logic of capitalism and the logic of some ameliorative alternatives to capitalism, as Mike Wallace has put it, the historian. And those two things kind of live cheek by jowl here inevitably. And each time we come to what seems like a terminal existential, we're never going to make it event. That sense of how do we create a sense of what makes us all the same kind, kinship, or as one might say, kindness. So there's a kind of a kindness that emerges in a city like New York. And out of that kindness, a sense of of the greater good, emerges a sense of what we need to do together to get by, to make it past 9/11, to make it past the drop dead moment, and to make it past this moment of pandemic. We can't wish it out of being. It's a result of all the things that make a city, proximity, transmission, interactivity. These are epidemiological terms, as well as the terms to describe the way cities work. And so, one has to say, where are we going to go to? Where to? What would be the alternative? There is no alternative. And not only that, this is the place where if we're going to make it, we'll find a way to do so. And that means that it gets very dark, very cold, very frightening, very isolated. But the most moving thing to me over the last year was the 7 o'clock shout out, where you couldn't really see anybody, cars honked on the street, but it was a sound, it was a cheer from up above. And then you'd look up and there's like a 5-year-old waving out of the window. And they were saying, thank you. But they're also saying, we're here. And they were demonstrating the essential kinship or kindness, as well as gratitude, which emerged from life in a city. And so I want to say, as Mark Twain might have said, rumors of the city's death are greatly exaggerated. And it'll make it through this. It's not clear now how, but it'll make it through it not by disavowing these qualities that make it so dangerous to be here, proximity, density, but by embracing them and understanding what new form of creativity is necessary in this new moment in order to answer the question, how can all the peoples of the world live together in a single place? So, for all you incredible people, the work that my colleague James and I have done for years on the city of New York, we'd be nowhere without you. Vishan and Vishan and so many of you there. We're working on this new film. It's called The Future of Cities. We didn't name that because of this conference. It's been called that for 5 years. But wow, doesn't it now seem to be like, whoa, what the hell is the future going to be? So it has this kind of narrative, yikes quality to it here in 2020. But I know that with your help and with the help of the people outside my window, we'll get by. So with many thanks to the 92nd Street Y and to the City of Tomorrow people for thinking of us and including us in this. God bless you all. And, we'll go forward. Thanks.